Welcome to the Edutaining History channel. Before we start, please let us know in the comments from where in the world you're listening to this video and what time it is. Please also like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy this type of video. Now let's dive in for the history of Great Britain. We have several parts with a total length of around 4-5 hours. Long before Britain was Britain, before England, Scotland or Wales existed. Even as concepts, the British Isles were home to peoples whose names we don't know, and whose languages have been lost to time. These islands, separated from continental Europe by rising sea levels around 8000 BC, became a laboratory for human civilization that would eventually influence the entire world. The story begins with the beaker culture, named not for any grand historical achievement, but for their distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessels found scattered across burial sites from Scotland to southern England. These people, arriving around 2500 BC, represent one of history's great mysteries. They weren't the first inhabitants of the islands. Hunter-gatherers had lived here for millennia. But they were the first to leave behind evidence of sophisticated organisation and astronomical knowledge. The Beaker people's greatest immortal legacy stands on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, Stonehenge. This isn't just a pile of old stones. It's one of humanity's most sophisticated prehistoric achievements, and understanding its construction reveals the remarkable capabilities of these ancient Britons. The monument was built in several phases over 1,500 years, beginning around 3100 BC. The final phase, completed around 1600 BC, required transporting 82 bluestones from the Priestley Hills in Wales, a distance of over 150 miles. Each stone weighs between 2 and 5 tons. The larger sarsen stones, some weighing up to 50 tons, were quarried from the Marlborough Downs, 20 miles away. Consider the logistics, moving a 50-ton stone 20 miles using only human power, wooden rollers and rope. Modern estimates suggest it would have required 500 people working in coordination, with sophisticated knowledge of leverage, engineering and route planning. This wasn't the work of primitive people, this was advanced civil engineering. But Stonehenge's true sophistication lies in its astronomical precision. The monument is aligned to track the summer and winter solstices with remarkable accuracy. The heel-stone perfectly frames the sunrise on the summer solstice, while the trilithons create sightlines that track the moon's complex 18.6-year cycle. This required centuries of careful observation and mathematical calculation. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that Stonehenge was part of a vast sacred landscape including hundreds of burial mounds, timber circles and processional avenues. This wasn't an isolated monument. It was the ceremonial centre of a complex society that controlled territory across southern Britain. Around 1200 BC, new peoples began arriving from continental Europe. These were the Celts, not a single tribe but a collection of related peoples sharing similar languages, religious beliefs, and cultural practices. The Celtic migrations weren't violent invasions, but gradual movements of people seeking new lands and opportunities. The Celts brought with them iron-working technology, which revolutionized agriculture, warfare, and daily life. Iron ploughs could break heavier soils, opening up new farmland. Iron weapons and tools were superior to bronze equivalents and could be produced more cheaply since iron ore was more abundant than the tin and copper needed for bronze. Celtic society was hierarchical but not rigidly stratified. At the top were warrior aristocrats who controlled land and cattle, the primary measures of wealth. Below them were free farmers, craftsmen and traders. At the bottom were slaves, usually prisoners of war or debtors. The Celts were not the barbarians that Roman propaganda portrayed. They had sophisticated legal systems with trained judges called brehons, who memorized complex law codes. They developed advanced metalworking techniques, creating intricate jewelry, weapons, and ceremonial objects that rival anything produced in the Mediterranean world. Celtic religion was complex and sophisticated, centered around druids, priests, judges, teachers, and healers who underwent 20 years of training. Druids memorized vast amounts of religious lore, legal precedents, genealogies, and astronomical knowledge. They conducted religious ceremonies, settled legal disputes, and served as diplomatic intermediaries between tribes. By the time Julius Caesar first invaded in 55 BC, Britain was divided among dozens of Celtic tribes, each controlling distinct territories and maintaining complex relationships of alliance, rivalry, and trade. By the time Julius Caesar first invaded in 55 BC, Britain was divided among dozens of Celtic tribes, each controlling distinct territories and maintaining complex relationships of alliance, rivalry, and trade. In the southeast, the Catuvellauni controlled the area around modern-day St Albans and had established themselves as the dominant power in southern Britain. Their capital at Camulodunum, Colchester, was a major trading centre with extensive connections to Gaul and the Roman world. The Iceni, led by Queen Boudica, controlled East Anglia and were known for their fierce independence and skilled metalworking. The Brigantes dominated northern England from the Humber to Hadrian's Wall, making them the largest tribal confederation in Britain. In the west, the Silures of Wales were renowned warriors who would later give the Romans enormous trouble. The Ordovices controlled central Wales while the Disciangli held the North Welsh coast. Scotland was divided among several peoples, the Caledoni in the Highlands, the Votadini in the southeast, and the mysterious Picts in the far north. The Picts, whose name means painted people in Latin, left behind elaborate stone carvings and symbol stones, but no written records in their own language. These tribes weren't isolated from the wider world. Archaeological evidence shows extensive trade networks connecting Britain to Ireland, Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean. British tin was essential for bronze production throughout Europe, while British gold, silver, and iron were highly prized. Celtic Britain also had sophisticated agricultural systems. The heavy plough, introduced around 500 BC, allowed cultivation of the heavy clay soils that had previously been unusable. This agricultural revolution supported larger populations and more complex societies. Celtic religion was animistic, seeing divine spirits in natural features like rivers, springs, groves, and hills. Sacred sites were often located at liminal places, boundaries between different worlds or territories. Water was particularly sacred, and Celtic peoples made elaborate offerings of weapons, jewellery, and other precious objects to rivers and lakes. The Celts practiced human sacrifice, though probably not as extensively as Roman sources claimed. Archaeological evidence suggests that sacrifice was reserved for special occasions and may have been voluntary in some cases. The famous bog bodies found across northern Europe, naturally mummified corpses preserved in peat bogs, show evidence of ritual killing but also of high status and careful preparation. Celtic art was distinctive and sophisticated, characterized by flowing abstract designs that avoided realistic representation. The La Tène style, named after a Swiss archaeological site, featured intricate spirals, knots, and stylized animal forms that would later influence medieval illuminated manuscripts. Celtic society was oral rather than literate. Knowledge was preserved and transmitted through trained specialists, druids for religious and legal matters, bards for history and genealogy, and craftsmen for technical skills. This oral tradition was remarkably accurate when Irish monks finally began writing down ancient stories in the medieval period. They preserved tales that can be traced back over 1,000 years. By the 1st century BC, Roman influence was already being felt in Britain. Roman merchants traded regularly with British tribes, and some British nobles had visited Rome. British warriors served as mercenaries in Gaul, gaining experience of Roman military tactics. Julius Caesar's invasions in 55 and 54 BC were more reconnaissance missions than serious conquest attempts. Caesar was primarily concerned with preventing British aid to his enemies in Gaul, and his expeditions achieved their limited objectives. But they also revealed Britain's wealth and strategic importance to future Roman leaders. The century between Caesar's invasions and Claudius's conquest in 43 AD saw increasing Roman influence in British affairs. Some tribes, like the Atrebates, became Roman clients, adopting Roman customs and coinage. Others, like the Cativellauni under Cunobelinus, Shakespeare's Cymbeline, maintained independence while engaging in extensive trade with Rome. This period also saw the emergence of proto-urban centres in Britain. Oppida, fortified settlements that served as political, economic and religious centres, developed across southern Britain. These weren't cities in the Roman sense, but they represented a move toward more centralised, complex societies. The stage was set for the Roman conquest that would transform Britain forever. But the Celtic peoples who awaited the Roman legions were not primitive barbarians. They were sophisticated societies with complex political systems, advanced technology and rich cultural traditions. The Romans would conquer Britain, but they would also be changed by it. The Roman conquest of Britain began not with military necessity, but with political ambition. Emperor Claudius, who had come to power after the assassination of Caligula, needed a military victory to legitimize his rule and prove himself to the Roman people. Britain, with its wealth, strategic location and reputation for fierce warriors, offered the perfect opportunity. The invasion force that landed in Kent in 43 AD was massive by ancient standards, 4 legions totalling approximately 40,000 men, plus an equal number of auxiliary troops. This was roughly 10% of Rome's entire military strength, demonstrating the importance Rome placed on the British conquest. The invasion was meticulously planned. Aulus Plautius, the invasion commander, had spent months gathering intelligence about British tribes, their alliances, and their military capabilities. The Romans exploited divisions among British tribes, securing the support of the Atrebates and other pro-Roman factions before landing. The initial campaign was remarkably successful. Within 4 years, Roman forces had conquered most of southern and central England. The key to Roman success wasn't just military superiority, though their disciplined legions, siege engines, and cavalry gave them significant advantages, but their sophisticated understanding of politics and diplomacy. The Romans didn't simply conquer, they co-opted. British nobles who submitted were allowed to keep their lands and status, provided they accepted Roman overlordship. Some, like Cogidubnus of the Atrebates, were granted Roman citizenship and became enthusiastic collaborators. This policy of selective cooperation divided British resistance and made conquest easier. Not all Britons accepted Roman rule quietly. Caratacus, son of Cunobelinus and leader of the Catuvellauni, conducted a brilliant guerrilla campaign against the Romans for nearly a decade. After losing conventional battles in the southeast, Caratacus retreated to Wales, where he united various tribes against Rome. Caratacus understood that he couldn't defeat Rome in pitched battle, so he adopted hit-and-run tactics, attacking Roman supply lines and isolated garrisons before melting back into the Welsh hills. This strategy was remarkably effective, tying down large numbers of Roman troops and preventing the consolidation of Roman rule. The campaign finally ended in 51 AD when Caratacus was betrayed by Queen Cartimandua of the Brigantes and handed over to the Romans. Brought to Rome in chains, Caratacus delivered a speech to the Senate that so impressed the Romans that Claudius granted him a pardon. Tacitus recorded his words, "If you want to rule the world, does it follow that everyone else welcomes enslavement?" Even more dramatic was the rebellion of Boudica in 60 to 61 AD. The revolt began when Roman officials seized the lands of the Iceni after the death of King Prasutagus, flogged his widow Boudica and raped his daughters. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was a systematic violation of the agreements that had allowed peaceful coexistence. Boudica's rebellion revealed the fragility of Roman rule in Britain. The Iceni were joined by the Trinovantes and other tribes who had suffered under Roman taxation and land seizures. The rebel army, estimated at over 100,000 warriors, destroyed 3 major Roman settlements: Camulodunum, Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St Albans. The destruction was total. Archaeological evidence shows layers of ash and burned debris from this period, along with evidence of systematic massacre. Tacitus claimed that 70,000 Romans and British collaborators were killed, and while this figure may be exaggerated, the scale of destruction was clearly enormous. The rebellion was finally crushed by Suetonius Paulinus at the Battle of Watling Street. Roman discipline and superior tactics overcame British numbers, and Boudica died shortly after, whether by suicide or illness is unknown. The rebellion's failure marked the end of organised British resistance to Roman rule. Wales proved to be Rome's most difficult conquest in Britain. The mountainous terrain favoured defenders, the tribes were fiercely independent, and the Druids provided both religious and political leadership for resistance. The Roman campaign against Wales was systematic and brutal. Suetonius Paulinus, before being recalled to deal with Boudica's rebellion, had launched an assault on Anglesey, Mona, the sacred centre of British Druidism. Tacitus described the scene: Roman soldiers crossing the Menai Strait while Druids on the shore called down curses and human sacrifices burned on altars. The destruction of the Druidic centre was both practical and symbolic. Druids were the intellectual elite of Celtic society, serving as priests, judges, teachers, and political advisors. By eliminating them, Rome hoped to destroy the cultural and religious foundations of British resistance. The conquest of Wales was completed under the Flavian emperors. Julius Frontinus systematically reduced the Silures between 74–78 AD, building a network of forts and roads that allowed Roman forces to control the Welsh valleys. His successor, Julius Agricola, completed the conquest by subduing the Ordovices in central Wales. Roman Wales was heavily militarised, with legionary fortresses at Caerleon and Chester, and a network of auxiliary forts controlling strategic valleys and mountain passes. Unlike lowland Britain, Wales never became fully Romanized. Latin inscriptions are rare. Roman villas are almost unknown, and native Celtic culture persisted throughout the Roman period. Scotland presented Rome with its greatest challenge in Britain. The Caledonian tribes were fierce warriors, the terrain was difficult, and the potential rewards seemed limited compared to the costs of conquest. Julius Agricola, governor from 78–84 AD, came closest to conquering Scotland. His campaigns pushed Roman forces as far north as the Moray Firth, and he won a major victory at Mons Graupius, possibly near modern Aberdeen, in 83 AD. Tacitus, who was Agricola's son-in-law, recorded a speech by the Caledonian leader Caratacus that included the famous line, "They make a desert and call it peace," but Agricola's conquests proved unsustainable. The Emperor Domitian recalled troops for campaigns on the Danube, and the Caledonians began a sustained guerrilla campaign against Roman positions. By 87 AD, Roman forces had withdrawn south of the Fourth Clyde Line. Hadrian's visit to Britain in 122 AD marked a fundamental change in Roman strategy. Instead of continuing expensive campaigns of conquest, Rome would build a wall and defend a fixed frontier. Hadrian's wall, stretching 73 miles from Wallsend on the River Tyne to Bowness on Solway, was one of the most impressive engineering projects in the ancient world. The wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a complex military system including forts, mile castles, turrets, and a military road. It was garrisoned by auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire, Germans, Dacians, Syrians, and others, who brought their own cultures and religions to the northern frontier. 20 years later, Antoninus Pius ordered the construction of a second wall further north, the Antonine Wall, running between the Forth and Clyde. This advance proved temporary. By 164 AD, Roman forces had withdrawn to Hadrian's Wall, which remained the frontier for the rest of the Roman period. The failure to conquer Scotland had profound implications. It meant that Britain would never be fully integrated into the Roman world, and that a significant population of unconquered Celts would remain on the empire's doorstep. The Picts, as the Romans called the northern tribes, would continue to raid Roman territory for centuries, requiring constant military vigilance and enormous expense. South of Hadrian's Wall, Roman Britain developed into one of the empire's most prosperous provinces. The transformation was remarkable. Within a century of conquest, Britain had acquired all the hallmarks of Roman civilization: cities, roads, aqueducts, amphitheatres, and villas. Londinium became the largest city in Britain, with a population approaching 60,000 at its peak. Built at the lowest crossing point of the Thames, it served as the commercial and administrative centre of the province. The city featured a basilica larger than St. Paul's Cathedral, public baths, an amphitheatre, and extensive docks handling trade from across the empire. Other major cities developed distinct characters. Eboracum, York, was a military centre and later an imperial capital when emperors visited Britain. Aquae Sulis, Bath, became a fashionable spa town, famous for its hot springs and temple complex, dedicated to Sulis Minerva, a Romano-British goddess combining Celtic and Roman elements. Camulodunum, Colchester, was established as a colonia, a settlement for retired legionaries, and featured Britain's first major Roman temple, dedicated to the deified Emperor Claudius. Verulamium, St. Albans, became a municipium, a self-governing city whose inhabitants enjoyed Latin rights. The Roman road network transformed Britain's geography and economy. Major routes like Watling Street, Ermine Street and the Fosse Way connected cities and military bases, facilitating trade, administration and troop movements. These roads were engineering marvels, built to last centuries with deep foundations, multiple layers of stone and gravel, and sophisticated drainage systems. Roman villas dotted the countryside, particularly in the south and east. These weren't just farmhouses, but centres of agricultural estates that supplied urban markets. The grandest villas, like Fishbourne Palace in Sussex and Chedworth in Gloucestershire, featured hypocauste heating, elaborate mosaics and formal gardens that rivaled anything in Italy. Roman Britain developed a sophisticated market economy based on agricultural surplus, mineral extraction and manufacturing. British grain fed the Rhine armies, British wool clothed much of northern Europe, and British metals, gold, silver, lead, tin and iron, were exported throughout the empire. The province's mineral wealth was extraordinary. The Mendip Hills produced lead and silver, Cornwall provided tin, and Wales yielded gold from mines like Dolaucothi. Iron was extracted from the Forest of Dean and the Weald of Kent and Sussex. These industries required substantial investment in infrastructure, technology and labour, much of it provided by Roman entrepreneurs and British collaborators. Agriculture was transformed by Roman techniques and crops. New vegetables like carrots, parsnips and cabbages were introduced, along with fruits like cherries and plums. Wine production was attempted, though with limited success in Britain's climate. More importantly, Roman agricultural techniques, including the heavy plough, crop rotation and systematic fertilisation, increased productivity and supported larger populations. Roman society in Britain was hierarchical, but offered opportunities for advancement unknown in pre-conquest Celtic society. At the top were Roman citizens, initially mostly immigrants from other provinces, but increasingly including Britons who had earned citizenship through military service or imperial favour. Below citizens were Latin rights holders, free people who enjoyed most civil rights but couldn't vote in Roman elections or hold high office. At the bottom were slaves who might be prisoners of war, debtors or the children of slaves. However, manumission, freeing of slaves, was common and freed slaves often became successful merchants or craftsmen. The Roman army was a major factor in British society. The 3 legions stationed in Britain, 2 Augusta at Caerleon, 6th Victrix at York, and 5th Valeria Victrix at Chester, plus numerous auxiliary units, represented a significant portion of the province's population. Soldiers served for 25 years, after which they received citizenship and land grants, often settling near their former bases. Roman Britain developed a unique religious culture that blended Roman, Celtic, and imported Eastern traditions. The Romans were generally tolerant of local religions, provided they didn't threaten public order or imperial authority. Celtic gods were often identified with Roman equivalents, a process called interpretatio Romana. Sulis, the Celtic goddess of the hot springs at Bath, became Sulis Minerva. Nodens, a Celtic healing god, was worshipped at a magnificent temple complex at Lydney in Gloucestershire. Mars, the Roman war god, acquired Celtic epithets like Casidius and Belatucadrus in northern Britain. Mystery religions from the east gained popularity. Particularly among soldiers, Mithraism, with its emphasis on courage, loyalty and salvation, appealed to military men. Mithraic temples have been found in London, York and along Hadrian's Wall. The cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, was popular in London and other commercial centres. Christianity arrived in Britain during the 2nd century, probably brought by merchants and soldiers. The first recorded British Christian martyr was St. Alban, executed during the Diocletian persecution around 304 AD. By the 4th century, Christianity was well established, with bishops attending the Council of Arles in 314 AD. The Chai rose symbol found on the 4th century mosaics and silver hoards shows that Christianity had penetrated the British elite. The Water Newton treasure discovered in Cambridgeshire includes some of the earliest known Christian silver vessels, suggesting a wealthy Christian community in the area. Education and literacy expanded under Roman rule. Latin became the language of administration, law, and high culture, though Celtic languages persisted in rural areas. Writing tablets from Vindolanda, a fort on Hadrian's Wall, provide fascinating glimpses of daily life, including personal letters, military reports, and shopping lists. The 3rd century brought crisis to the Roman Empire, and Britain wasn't immune. The crisis of the 3rd century saw rapid turnover of emperors, economic inflation, barbarian invasions, and the temporary fragmentation of the empire. Britain experienced particular turmoil during the revolt of Caratacus, 286–293 AD, a naval commander who declared himself emperor and ruled Britain and northern Gaul independently for 7 years. Carausius's revolt reflected both Britain's strategic importance and its growing sense of separate identity. The crisis was resolved by Diocletian's reforms, which divided the empire into eastern and western halves and established the tetrarchy ruled by 4 emperors. Britain was divided into 4 provinces: Britannia Prima, Britannia Secunda, Flavia Caesariensis, and Maxima Caesariensis, reducing the power of any single governor. The 4th century saw a revival of British prosperity. New villa construction, urban renewal, and artistic achievements suggest that the province recovered from 3rd century difficulties. The Hinton St Mary mosaic, featuring what may be the earliest known depiction of Christ in British art, exemplifies this cultural flowering. However, new threats were emerging. Saxon pirates raided the eastern and southern coasts, leading to the construction of the Saxon shore forts, a chain of coastal fortifications from Norfolk to Hampshire. Irish raiders attacked the western coasts, while Pictish incursions from Scotland continued to threaten the northern frontier. The end of Roman rule in Britain was gradual rather than sudden. The traditional date of 410 AD, when Emperor Honorius supposedly told the Britons to look to their own defences, marks not a dramatic withdrawal but the culmination of a process that had been underway for decades. The crisis began with the usurpation of Magnus Maximus in 383 AD. This Spanish-born general, proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain, withdrew significant forces from the province for his continental campaigns. Although Maximus was defeated and killed in 388 AD, the troops he took were never fully replaced. Further withdrawals occurred under the usurpers Marcus, Gratian, and Constantine III between 406 to 411 AD. Each took troops from Britain to support their bids for imperial power, leaving the province increasingly defenceless against barbarian raids. The Romano-British elite, faced with the collapse of imperial administration and military protection, were forced to organise their own defences. Some hired Saxon mercenaries to fight against Pictish and Irish raiders, a decision that would have momentous consequences. Archaeological evidence suggests that Roman urban life collapsed rapidly in the early 5th century. Coins ceased to be minted or imported, pottery production became localized and crude, and many towns were abandoned. However, some elements of Roman civilization persisted, particularly Christianity and Latin literacy among the educated elite. The end of Roman Britain marked the conclusion of nearly 4 centuries of Mediterranean civilization in the British Isles. The Romans had transformed Britain from a collection of Iron Age tribes into a sophisticated province with cities, roads, industries, and a money economy. They had introduced new crops, technologies, and ideas that would influence British development for centuries. But Roman Britain had also developed its own distinct character, blending Roman and Celtic elements in unique ways. This Romano-British culture would provide the foundation for the post-Roman kingdoms that emerged in the 5th and 6th centuries, and its influence can still be traced in British place names, archaeological remains, and cultural traditions. The Roman period established patterns that would shape British history for centuries. The division between Highland and Lowland zones, the importance of London as a commercial centre, the strategic significance of the Scottish border, and the complex relationship between native and immigrant populations. In many ways, Roman Britain laid the foundations for the medieval kingdoms that would follow. The end of Roman rule in Britain around 410 AD didn't just mark a change of government, it represented the collapse of an entire civilization. Within a generation, the sophisticated urban culture that had flourished for nearly 4 centuries simply vanished. Cities were abandoned, trade networks collapsed, literacy virtually disappeared, and the money economy reverted to barter. This wasn't a gradual decline, but a catastrophic collapse. Archaeological evidence shows that major Roman cities like Wroxeter, Silchester and Caerwent were largely deserted by 450 AD. London, which had been home to perhaps 60,000 people at its peak, shrank to a few thousand inhabitants clustered around the old Roman walls. The reasons for this collapse were complex. Without Roman administration, there was no system for collecting taxes, maintaining roads, or organising trade. Without Roman military protection, long-distance commerce became too dangerous. Without Roman demand for British products, the economic basis for urban life disappeared. The Romano-British elite, faced with the breakdown of the system that had sustained them, had few options. Some fled to Brittany, establishing communities that preserved Romano-British culture and the Breton language. Others retreated to fortified hill forts, reverting to the Iron Age lifestyle of their ancestors. A few attempted to maintain Roman traditions in isolated pockets, particularly in Wales and the southwest. Into this chaos came new peoples from across the North Sea. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled centuries later, dates the first Saxon arrivals to 449 AD, when the British King Vortigern invited Hengist and Horsa to help fight against Pictish raiders. Whether this specific story is true, archaeological evidence confirms that Germanic settlers began arriving in significant numbers during the mid-5th century. These weren't just raiders, but entire peoples seeking new homes. The Angles came from southern Denmark, the Saxons from northern Germany, and the Jutes from the Jutland Peninsula. They brought their families, their livestock, their gods, and their language, Old English, which would eventually become the dominant language of Britain. The Anglo-Saxon settlement was a complex process that varied greatly across different regions. In some areas, it appears to have been relatively peaceful, with Germanic settlers filling the vacuum left by the collapse of Roman administration. In others, there's evidence of violent conquest and the displacement of Romano-British populations. The genetic evidence suggests that the Anglo-Saxon migration was substantial, but not overwhelming. Modern DNA studies indicate that the English population is roughly 40% Anglo-Saxon, 40% pre-Roman Celtic, and 20% later additions. This suggests significant intermarriage between Germanic settlers and Romano-British populations, despite the cultural dominance of Anglo-Saxon traditions. The linguistic evidence is even more striking. Old English became the dominant language throughout most of what is now England, with Celtic languages surviving only in Wales, Cornwall, and parts of Scotland. This linguistic replacement was so complete that only a handful of Celtic words survived in English, mostly place names and geographical features. By 600 AD, Anglo-Saxon England had crystallised into 7 major kingdoms, later known as the Heptarchy: Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria. Each had its own royal dynasty, laws and customs, and they spent much of the next 4 centuries fighting each other for supremacy. Kent was the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom to achieve prominence, largely due to its strategic position controlling trade across the English Channel. King Ethelbert of Kent, 616, was the first English king to convert to Christianity and the first to issue a written law code. Canterbury became the ecclesiastical capital of England, a position it retains today. Wessex, the West Saxons, controlled much of southern England from their capital at Winchester. The kingdom was founded according to legend by Cerdic in 519 AD, though the historical reality was probably more complex. Wessex would eventually become the dominant Anglo-Saxon kingdom and provide the royal dynasty that united England. Northumbria was formed by the union of 2 smaller kingdoms, Bernicia and Deira, and at its height controlled territory from the Humber to the Forth. The kingdom reached its zenith under kings like Edwin, Oswald and Oswiu in the 7th century, when it was the most powerful state in Britain. Mercia dominated the English Midlands and became the most powerful kingdom in the 8th century under kings like Ethelbald and Offa. Offa's dyke, a massive earthwork running along the Welsh border, demonstrates Mercian power and organisational capability. East Anglia controlled the fertile lands of Norfolk and Suffolk and was enormously wealthy, as demonstrated by the spectacular ship burial at Sutton Hoo. The kingdom produced some of the finest Anglo-Saxon art and metalwork. Essex, the East Saxons, controlled the area around modern London, while one Sussex, the South Saxons, occupied the territory between the Thames and the English Channel. These kingdoms weren't static entities, but constantly shifting alliances and territories. The concept of Bretwalda, Britain ruler, emerged to describe kings who achieved temporary supremacy over other Anglo-Saxon rulers, though this was more a matter of personal dominance than institutional authority. One of the most significant developments in early Anglo-Saxon England was the conversion to Christianity. This process began in 597 AD when Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine to convert the English. Augustine landed in Kent, where King Ethelbert's Frankish wife Bertha was already Christian, and established his mission at Canterbury. The conversion wasn't uniform or immediate. Different kingdoms converted at different times and through different influences. Kent and Essex were converted through Roman missions, while Northumbria was influenced by Irish Christianity from Iona. Mercia and the other Midland kingdoms were among the last to convert. The 2 streams of Christianity, Roman and Celtic, had developed different practices during the centuries of separation. They disagreed about the date of Easter, the style of monastic tonsure, and various liturgical practices. The Christianization of Anglo-Saxon England had profound cultural consequences. Latin literacy was reintroduced, monasteries became centres of learning and manuscript production, and stone churches began to replace wooden temples. The fusion of Germanic and Christian traditions produced a distinctive Anglo-Saxon culture that would influence English civilization for centuries. Anglo-Saxon monasticism produced some of the greatest scholars and missionaries of the early medieval period. Monasteries like Wearmouth Jarrow in Northumbria, Malmesbury in Wessex, and Glastonbury in Somerset became centres of learning that rivaled anything in continental Europe. The Venerable Bede, 603–735, a monk at Jarrow, wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, one of the finest historical works of the medieval period. Bede's history is our primary source for early Anglo-Saxon history, and demonstrates the high level of scholarship achieved in Anglo-Saxon monasteries. Anglo-Saxon missionaries played a crucial role in converting continental Europe. Willibrord evangelized the Frisians, while Boniface, originally Winfrith of Crediton, became the apostle of Germany and was martyred while preaching to the Frisians in 754 AD. The monasteries also preserved classical learning during the chaos of the early medieval period. Anglo-Saxon scholars copied and preserved Latin texts that might otherwise have been lost, and their scriptoriums produced some of the most beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the medieval period. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created around 715–720 AD, represents the pinnacle of Anglo-Saxon artistic achievement. This masterpiece combines Celtic, Germanic and Mediterranean influences in a synthesis that is uniquely English. The intricate interlaced patterns, stylized animals and brilliant colours demonstrate the sophistication of Anglo-Saxon culture at its height. Anglo-Saxon society was hierarchical but offered more social mobility than many medieval societies. At the top were kings and their warrior retinues, bound together by oaths of loyalty and sustained by gift-giving and shared warfare. The Great Hall was the centre of aristocratic life, where warriors feasted, listened to poetry and planned their next campaigns. The warrior culture of the Anglo-Saxons is vividly portrayed in poems like Beowulf, which tells the story of a Geatish hero who fights monsters and dragons. While the poem was probably composed in the 8th century, it preserves memories of earlier Germanic society and values. The emphasis on loyalty, courage and honour reflects the ideals that bound Anglo-Saxon warrior bands together. Below the aristocracy were free farmers, ceorls, who owned their own land and owed military service to their lords. These formed the backbone of Anglo-Saxon society, providing both agricultural production and military manpower. At the bottom were slaves, thralls, who might be prisoners of war, debtors, or the descendants of slaves. Anglo-Saxon law was sophisticated and varied between kingdoms. The earliest written law codes, like those of Ethelbert of Kent and Ine of Wessex, show a society trying to balance traditional Germanic customs with Christian morality. The concept of wergild, man price, compensation paid for killing or injuring someone, was central to Anglo-Saxon justice and helped reduce blood feuds. Women in Anglo-Saxon society had more rights than in many medieval cultures. They could own property, inherit land, and even rule kingdoms in their own right. Queens like Ethelflaed of Mercia played important political and military roles, while abbesses like Hild of Whitby wielded considerable influence in both secular and religious affairs. By the 8th century, the balance of power among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was shifting. Mercia, under Offa 757–796, had achieved dominance over most of England south of the Humber, but this supremacy proved temporary The future lay with Wessex, the kingdom that would eventually unite England under its rule. Wessex's rise was gradual but persistent. The kingdom expanded westward into Devon and Cornwall, absorbing Celtic populations and territories. The West Saxon kings developed effective administrative systems and maintained strong military forces that could respond quickly to external threats. The kingdom's strategic position in southern England gave it advantages in trade and diplomacy. Wessex maintained close relations with the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, and West Saxon kings often married Frankish princesses. These connections provided access to continental ideas, technologies and military support. Wessex also benefited from effective leadership. Kings like Ian, 680 to 726, and Egbert, 802-839, combined military prowess with administrative skill, creating institutions that would survive the coming Viking onslaught. The West Saxon law codes were among the most sophisticated in Anglo-Saxon England, and the kingdom's church was well organised and influential. While the Anglo-Saxons were establishing their kingdoms in what would become England, Celtic societies persisted in Wales, Scotland and Ireland. These regions developed their own distinctive cultures and political systems, often in conscious opposition to Anglo-Saxon expansion. Wales was divided among several kingdoms, the most important being Gwynedd in the north, Powys in the centre and Dyfed in the southwest. Welsh society remained more traditionally Celtic, with a strong bardic tradition that preserved ancient stories and genealogies. The Welsh language evolved from Brythonic, the language spoken in Roman Britain, and Welsh law codes preserved many pre-Roman Celtic legal traditions. The Welsh kingdoms faced constant pressure from their Anglo-Saxon neighbours. Offa's Dyke, built in the late 8th century, marked the frontier between Mercia and Wales and demonstrated the military threat posed by Anglo-Saxon expansion. Despite this pressure, Welsh kingdoms maintained their independence and developed a strong sense of national identity. Scotland was even more complex, divided among four main peoples: the Picts in the north and east, the Scots, originally from Ireland, in the west, the Britons in the south, and the Anglo-Saxons of Northumbria in the southeast. The Picts were the most mysterious of these peoples, leaving behind elaborate stone carvings and symbol stones, but no written records in their own language. The kingdom of Dal Riata, established by Scots from Ireland in the 6th century, gradually expanded eastward from its base in Argyll. The union of Scots and Picts under Kenneth MacAlpine around 843 AD created the Kingdom of Alba, the foundation of medieval Scotland. Ireland remained outside Anglo-Saxon control and developed its own unique Christian culture. Irish monasteries became famous throughout Europe for their learning and missionary activity. Irish monks established monasteries from Iceland to Italy, spreading Celtic Christianity and preserving classical learning during the darkest periods of the early Middle Ages. Anglo-Saxon England developed a sophisticated economy based on agriculture, trade and craft production. The fertile lowlands of England supported a growing population, while new agricultural techniques increased productivity. The heavy plough, introduced during the Roman period, was widely adopted, allowing cultivation of heavier soils. Trade networks connected Anglo-Saxon England to the wider European economy. English wool was exported to Flanders, while luxury goods like silk, spices and wine were imported from the Mediterranean. The discovery of Anglo-Saxon coins across northern Europe demonstrates the extent of these trade connections. Craft production reached high levels of sophistication. Anglo-Saxon metalworkers produced some of the finest jewellery and weapons of the early medieval period. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, dating to the early 7th century, contained gold and garnet jewellery of extraordinary quality, as well as silver vessels from Byzantium and a helmet that may have been made in Sweden. Towns began to reappear in Anglo-Saxon England, though they were very different from Roman cities. Places like Hamwick, Southampton, Ipswich and York developed as trading centres, while others grew around royal palaces or important monasteries. These early towns were small by later standards, but represented the beginning of urban revival after the collapse of Roman civilization. By the late 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England had achieved a level of prosperity and stability unknown since the end of Roman rule. The kingdoms had developed effective governments, the church was well established and influential, and trade was flourishing. Monasteries were centres of learning and artistic achievement, while royal courts patronised poets and craftsmen. This prosperity, however, made England an attractive target for raiders from across the North Sea. The first recorded Viking raid occurred in 793 AD, when Norsemen attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, one of the holiest sites in Anglo-Saxon England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. They consisted of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. The attack on Lindisfarne was more than just a raid. It was a psychological shock that announced the arrival of a new threat. The Vikings had superior ships, different military tactics, and no respect for Christian sanctity. They would transform Anglo-Saxon England just as dramatically as the Anglo-Saxons had transformed Roman Britain. The Anglo-Saxon period had seen the creation of a new civilization in Britain. Germanic settlers had not simply conquered the Romano-British population, but had created something entirely new. A fusion of Germanic, Celtic and Christian elements that was uniquely English. The language, laws, customs and institutions developed during this period would form the foundation of English civilization for centuries to come. The Seven Kingdoms had created the political framework that would eventually be united under a single crown. The conversion to Christianity had connected England to the wider European world while preserving distinctive local traditions. The development of towns, trade and craft production had created the economic basis for future growth. Most importantly, the Anglo-Saxon period had established the cultural patterns that would define English identity. A warrior aristocracy bound by oaths of loyalty, in a free peasantry with rights and obligations, a church that combined learning with pastoral care, and a legal system that balanced royal authority with local custom. The Vikings would test all of these achievements, but they would not destroy them. Instead, the coming centuries would see the forging of a unified English kingdom that combined Anglo-Saxon traditions with Viking innovations, creating the medieval England that would eventually conquer much of the world. The Viking Age began with a thunderclap that echoed across medieval Europe. On June 8, 793 AD, dragon-prowed ships appeared off the coast of Northumbria, and armed men waded ashore onto the holy island of Lindisfarne. What followed was not just a raid, but a sacrilege that shocked the Christian world. The monastery of St. Cuthbert, one of the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon England, was plundered, its monks slaughtered or enslaved, and its treasures carried off across the North Sea. The attack on Lindisfarne was perfectly calculated for maximum psychological impact. Monasteries were not just religious centres, but repositories of wealth, learning and cultural identity. They were also defenceless, their inhabitants committed to peace and prayer rather than warfare. The Vikings had identified the soft underbelly of Anglo-Saxon civilization and struck with devastating effect. But who were these Vikings, and why did they suddenly appear to terrorize Christian Europe? The answer lies in the complex social and economic changes occurring in Scandinavia during the 8th and 9th centuries. Population growth, political consolidation, and technological innovations combined to create both the means and the motivation for overseas expansion. The development of the longship was crucial to Viking success. These vessels were technological marvels, shallow drafted enough to navigate rivers, seaworthy enough for ocean voyages, and fast enough to strike before defenders could organise resistance. A typical longship could carry 30 to 60 warriors and travel at speeds up to 15 knots under favourable conditions. Equally important were social changes in Scandinavian society. The emergence of powerful kings was displacing traditional local leaders, creating a class of displaced warriors seeking new opportunities. Younger sons of noble families, denied inheritance under primogeniture, looked overseas for wealth and status. The warrior culture of Scandinavia, with its emphasis on courage, honour and the pursuit of fame, made raiding an attractive career choice. The early Viking raids, while terrifying, were relatively small-scale affairs. This changed dramatically in 865 AD with the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army, a massive force led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ubba. This wasn't a raiding party but an army of conquest. Contemporary sources suggest it numbered in the thousands, making it one of the largest military forces seen in Britain since the Roman legions. The army was multinational, including Danes, Norwegians and Swedes, united by the prospect of conquest and plunder. The Great Heathen Army's strategy was sophisticated and systematic. Rather than random raiding, they conducted coordinated campaigns designed to conquer and hold territory. They established fortified bases, negotiated with local rulers, and exploited divisions among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their first target was East Anglia, whose King Edmund was captured and, according to later legend, martyred for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. The army then moved north into Northumbria, where they captured York, which they renamed Jorvik, and established a Viking kingdom that would last for nearly a century. From York, the Vikings turned south into Mercia, the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom. King Burgred was driven into exile, and the Vikings installed a puppet ruler. By 874 AD, 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen to Viking conquest. Only Wessex remained independent. The survival of Wessex, and with it Anglo-Saxon independence, depended on one man, Alfred, who became king in 871 AD at the age of 22. Alfred faced an almost impossible situation. His kingdom was under constant attack. His army was demoralised and his treasury was empty. Yet he would not only survive but lay the foundations for the eventual unification of England. Alfred's early reign was a series of disasters. The Vikings defeated him repeatedly, and by 878 AD he was reduced to hiding in the Somerset marshes with a handful of followers. It was during this dark period that the famous story of Alfred burning the cakes supposedly occurred, a legend that, while probably fictional, captures the desperate nature of his situation. The turning point came at the Battle of Edington in May 878 AD. Alfred had spent months rebuilding his forces, calling up the feared militia from across Wessex and gathering support from other Anglo-Saxon survivors. The battle was decisive. The Viking army was routed, and their leader Guthrum was forced to convert to Christianity and accept Alfred as his godfather. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum established the Danelaw, a line running roughly from London to Chester that divided England between Anglo-Saxon and Viking territories. This wasn't just a military agreement, but a recognition of cultural and legal differences. In the Danelaw, Danish law and customs prevailed, while Wessex remained Anglo-Saxon. Alfred used the breathing space provided by the treaty to transform Wessex into a military and administrative powerhouse. He created a network of fortified towns called burghs, strategically placed so that no part of Wessex was more than 20 miles from a fortified position. These burghs served multiple purposes: military bases, administrative centres, and commercial hubs that stimulated economic growth. The king also reformed the military system, creating a standing army supported by a reorganised fyrd. Half the militia was always on duty while the other half worked their farms, ensuring continuous military readiness. Alfred also built England's first navy, recognising that Viking raids could only be stopped at sea. Perhaps most importantly, Alfred promoted learning and literacy. He personally translated several Latin works into Old English, including Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care. He established schools, imported scholars from Wales and the continent, and began the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of English history that continued for centuries. Alfred's son Edward the Elder, 819 to 924, and daughter Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, continued his work of reconquest. This sibling partnership was one of the most effective military collaborations in medieval history, combining Edward's resources as King of Wessex with Ethelflaed's strategic position in Mercia. Ethelflaed was a remarkable figure, one of the few women to exercise independent military command in medieval Europe. After her husband's death in 911, she ruled Mercia in her own right, building fortifications, leading armies, and negotiating with Viking leaders. Her fortress at Tamworth became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The reconquest was methodical and systematic. Brother and sister coordinated their campaigns, building fortified positions and gradually pushing the Vikings back. They exploited divisions among Viking leaders, negotiated with those willing to submit, and crushed those who resisted. By 918, when Ethelflaed died, most of the Danelaw south of the Humber had been reconquered. Edward continued the campaign, and by his death in 924 he was recognised as overlord by the Scots, the Welsh princes, and the remaining Viking rulers in York. Edward's son Athelstan, 924 to 939, completed the unification of England. In 927 he conquered the Viking kingdom of York, becoming the first ruler to control all of England south of the Scottish border. He styled himself King of the English and later King of all Britain, marking a new phase in English political development. Athelstan's court was one of the most cosmopolitan in Europe. He maintained diplomatic relations with continental rulers, married his sisters to European princes, and patronised scholars and artists from across the known world. His law codes were among the most sophisticated of the early medieval period, attempting to create uniform legal standards across his diverse kingdom. The king's greatest triumph came at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, where he defeated a coalition of Scots, Vikings, and Welsh princes. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle celebrated this victory in one of its finest poems, describing how "never yet in this island before this, by what books tell us and our ancient sages, was a greater slaughter of a host made by the edge of the sword. Athelstan's death in 939 triggered a new period of Viking resurgence. The great Danish king Harald Bluetooth and his son Sweyn Forkbeard launched a series of invasions that would ultimately conquer England. This second wave of Viking attacks was different from the first, better organised, better funded, and led by established kingdoms rather than adventurous war bands. The renewed Viking threat coincided with the reign of Ethelred the Unready, 978 to 1016, whose epithet unread actually means ill-advised rather than unprepared. Ethelred's reign was marked by a series of military disasters and policy failures that ultimately led to the conquest of England by the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Cnut. Ethelred's strategy of paying Danegeld, tribute to buy off Viking raiders, proved counterproductive. Rather than deterring attacks, the payments advertised England's wealth and demonstrated the kingdom's weakness. Between 991 and 1012, Ethelred paid over £150,000 of silver to Viking armies, an enormous sum that bankrupted the royal treasury without providing lasting security. The policy reached its nadir with the St. Brice's Day massacre in 1002, when Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes in England. The massacre, which included the sister of King Sweyn of Denmark, provoked a massive retaliation that devastated much of England. Sweyn's subsequent invasions were motivated as much by personal revenge as political ambition. Sweyn Forkbeard's final invasion in 1013 met little resistance. The English nobility, exhausted by decades of warfare and taxation, offered minimal opposition. Ethelred fled to Normandy, and Sweyn was proclaimed King of England. However, Sweyn's sudden death in February 1014 created a succession crisis that briefly restored Ethelred to the throne. The real conqueror was Sweyn's son Cnut, who returned in 1015 with a massive army. Cnut was not just a Viking raider but a sophisticated ruler who understood the importance of legitimacy and continuity. After defeating Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside at the Battle of Essandoun in 1016, Cnut married Ethelred's widow Emma and adopted many Anglo-Saxon governmental practices. Cnut's reign, 1016 to 1035, marked the high point of Scandinavian power in medieval Europe. He ruled not just England but also Denmark and Norway, creating a North Sea empire that dominated northern European trade. In England, he proved to be an effective and popular ruler, maintaining Anglo-Saxon laws and customs while bringing Scandinavian efficiency to royal administration. The famous story of Cnut commanding the tide to retreat, often misunderstood as an example of royal arrogance, actually demonstrates his wisdom. According to the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, Cnut staged this demonstration to show his courtiers that even kings were subject to God's power. A sophisticated piece of political theatre that enhanced his reputation for humility and piety. Cnut's empire died with him in 1035. His sons Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut proved incapable of maintaining their father's achievements, and by 1042 the Anglo-Saxon dynasty had been restored under Edward the Confessor, Ethelred's son who had spent his exile in Normandy. Edward's reign, 1042 to 1066, was marked by relative peace and prosperity, but also by the growing influence of Norman culture at the English court. Edward's long exile in Normandy had made him more French than English in many ways, and he surrounded himself with Norman advisors and clerics. This Norman influence would have profound consequences for England's future. The king's piety earned him sainthood, but his political skills were limited. He failed to produce an heir, creating a succession crisis that would tear England apart. The great noble families, particularly the House of Godwin, accumulated enormous power during his reign, setting the stage for the civil conflicts that would follow his death. The most powerful figure in later Anglo-Saxon England was not the king, but Earl Godwin of Wessex, whose family controlled much of southern England. Godwin was a political survivor who had served under Cnut, married his daughter to Edward the Confessor, and placed his sons in key earldoms across the kingdom. Godwin's son Harold became Earl of East Anglia and later Wessex, making him the most powerful nobleman in England. Harold was everything Edward was not: a skilled military commander, an effective administrator, and a charismatic leader who commanded loyalty from both nobles and common soldiers. The Godwin family's power was demonstrated in 1051 when they were briefly exiled following a dispute with Edward, only to return the following year with an army that forced the king to restore their lands and titles. This episode showed that real power in England lay not with the crown, but with the great noble families. While England enjoyed relative peace during Edward's reign, the Welsh border remained turbulent. The rise of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, who united most of Wales under his rule by 1055, posed a serious threat to English security. Gruffydd's raids into English territory and his alliance with exiled English nobles created a constant source of instability. Harold Godwinson's campaigns against Gruffydd in 1062 to 1063 demonstrated his military capabilities and enhanced his reputation as England's premier war leader. The systematic conquest of Wales, achieved through a combination of land and sea operations, showed Harold's strategic thinking and organisational skills. Gruffydd's death in 1063, killed by his own men after Harold's relentless pressure, eliminated the Welsh threat and secured Harold's position as Edward's likely successor. The Welsh campaigns also provided Harold with experienced troops and proven tactics that would serve him well in the crises of 1066. Edward the Confessor's Norman connections created complications that would ultimately prove fatal to Anglo-Saxon England. His appointment of Norman clerics to high church positions, his friendship with Norman nobles, and his alleged promise of the English throne to William of Normandy created a Norman party within England that looked across the Channel for leadership. The relationship between England and Normandy was complex and multifaceted. Norman and English nobles intermarried, Norman merchants traded in English ports, and Norman clerics served in English churches. This cultural exchange enriched both societies, but also created conflicting loyalties that would be tested in 1066. William of Normandy's claim to the English throne rested on several foundations: Edward's alleged promise, Harold Godwinson's supposed oath of fealty, given according to Norman sources when Harold was shipwrecked on the Norman coast, and his kinship with Edward through Emma of Normandy. While these claims were disputed by the English, they provided William with the legal justification he needed for invasion. Edward the Confessor's death on January 5, 1066 precipitated the greatest succession crisis in English history. 4 claimants emerged for the throne: Harold Godwinson, who was elected by the Witan and Royal Council and crowned immediately; William of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the succession; Harold Hardrada of Norway, who based his claim on an agreement between his predecessor Magnus and Harthacnut; and Edgar Atheling, Edward's great-nephew and the only claimant with clear hereditary right. Harold Godwinson's election and coronation gave him the advantage of legitimacy and possession, but his position was precarious. He faced invasion threats from both Normandy and Norway, while dealing with internal opposition from his own brother Tostig, whom he had exiled the previous year. The year 1066 became a test of Harold's military and political skills. He mobilised the largest army in English history, stationed fleets to guard against invasion, and maintained a state of military readiness for months. The strain on England's resources was enormous, and by September, Harold was forced to dismiss much of his army and navy. The first invasion came not from Normandy, but from Norway. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, landed in Yorkshire with a massive army that included not only Norwegians but also Flemish mercenaries and English exiles led by Tostig Godwinson. The invasion force was so large that it required 300 ships to transport it across the North Sea. The Norwegians won an initial victory at Fulford Gate on September 20th. Defeating the Northern Earls Edwin and Morcar. However, this success proved temporary. Harold Godwinson force-marched his army 185 miles from London to York in just 4 days, one of the most remarkable military movements in medieval history. The Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066 was a complete English victory. Both Harald Hardrada and Tostig were killed, along with most of their army. The Norwegian survivors required only 24 ships to carry them home, a measure of the slaughter that occurred. The battle marked the end of the Viking Age in England. Never again would Scandinavian armies seriously threaten English independence. Harold had proven himself a military commander of the highest calibre, but his triumph was short-lived. While Harold was fighting Vikings in Yorkshire, William of Normandy was crossing the English Channel with an invasion force of his own. William had spent months preparing for the invasion, gathering troops from across northern France, building a fleet of transport ships and securing papal blessing for his enterprise. The Norman army that landed at Pevensey on September 28th was different from previous invaders. This was a feudal host led by armoured knights fighting on horseback, supported by archers and infantry. The Normans brought with them not just military superiority, but a different social and political system that would transform England. Harold received news of the Norman landing while celebrating his victory at Stamford Bridge. Once again, he was forced to march his army across England at breakneck speed, covering 250 miles in just 6 days. This time, however, the forced march would prove costly. The Battle of Hastings on October the 14th, 1066 was one of the most decisive battles in English history. Harold's army, exhausted from their march and depleted by casualties at Stamford Bridge, faced William's fresh troops on Senlac Hill. The battle lasted all day, with the English shield wall initially holding firm against Norman cavalry charges. The turning point came when rumours spread that William had been killed. As Norman morale wavered, William dramatically removed his helmet to show he was alive, rallying his troops for a final assault. The English line finally broke and Harold was killed, whether by an arrow to the eye, as the Bayeux Tapestry suggests, or by Norman swords, as other sources claim. William's victory at Hastings was just the beginning of the Norman conquest. The new king faced widespread resistance, particularly in the north, where English nobles allied with Scottish and Danish forces to challenge Norman rule. William's response was systematic and brutal. The harrying of the north in 1069 to 1070 devastated Yorkshire and Durham, creating a wasteland that took generations to recover. The Norman conquest was not just a change of dynasty, but a complete transformation of English society. William replaced the entire Anglo-Saxon nobility with Norman and French followers, redistributed land according to feudal principles, and introduced continental administrative practices. The English language was displaced from official use by Norman French, creating a linguistic divide that would last for centuries. Yet the conquest was also a synthesis. The Normans adopted many Anglo-Saxon institutions, particularly the sophisticated administrative system that made England the most efficiently governed kingdom in medieval Europe. The fusion of Norman military prowess with Anglo-Saxon governmental expertise created a hybrid civilization that would prove remarkably successful. The Anglo-Saxon period had created the foundations of English civilization, the language, laws, and cultural traditions that would define English identity for centuries. The Vikings had tested these foundations and found them strong enough to survive conquest and absorption. The Normans would build upon these foundations, creating the medieval English kingdom that would eventually dominate much of the world. The year 1066 marked the end of one chapter in English history and the beginning of another. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were gone forever, but their legacy lived on in the institutions, customs, and cultural patterns that would shape the Norman and Plantagenet kingdoms that followed. England had been conquered, but it had not been destroyed. It had been transformed into something new and potentially more powerful than what had come before. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings was merely the first act in a drama that would unfold over decades. The Norman conquest was not a single event, but a prolonged process of subjugation, resistance, and transformation that fundamentally altered the character of English civilization. The immediate aftermath of Hastings revealed the fragility of William's position. While Harold Godwinson was dead and his army scattered, much of England remained unconquered. The northern earls Edwin and Morcar had not fought at Hastings and still commanded substantial forces. Edgar Atheling, the last male heir of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, was proclaimed king by the remaining English nobles. London's gates remained closed to the Norman duke. William's response demonstrated the strategic brilliance that had made him master of Normandy. Rather than marching directly on London, he conducted a systematic campaign of devastation around the capital, cutting off its supplies and demonstrating the futility of resistance. Canterbury, Winchester, and other major towns submitted without a fight, and by Christmas 1066, William was crowned king in Westminster Abbey. The coronation ceremony itself was symbolic of the complex nature of Norman rule. William was crowned by Uldred, Archbishop of York, using traditional Anglo-Saxon rituals, but the ceremony was conducted in both English and French. When the congregation shouted their acclamation, nervous Norman guards outside thought a riot had begun and set fire to nearby buildings. The smoke and flames that filled the abbey during William's coronation seemed to prophesy the turbulent reign that would follow. The most serious challenge to Norman rule came in 1069 to 1070, when a coalition of English nobles, supported by a Danish fleet and Scottish forces, launched a coordinated rebellion across northern England. The revolt was led by Edgar Atheling and included prominent Anglo-Saxon survivors like Waltheof, Earl of Northumbria, and Gospatrick, Earl of Bamborough. The rebellion initially achieved remarkable success. York fell to the rebels and Norman garrisons across the north were overwhelmed. For a moment it seemed possible that the Norman conquest might be reversed. However, the rebels failed to coordinate their efforts effectively, and William's response was swift and devastating. The harrying of the north that followed was one of the most brutal campaigns in medieval European history. William's armies systematically destroyed everything between York and Durham. Crops, livestock, agricultural tools, and entire villages were put to the torch. The Domesday Book, compiled 20 years later, still recorded vast areas of Yorkshire as waste and uninhabited and uncultivated. The human cost was enormous. Contemporary chroniclers, even those sympathetic to William, described the campaign in horrific terms. Orderic Vitalis wrote that William made no effort to restrain his fury and punish the innocent with the guilty. In his anger he commanded that all crops and herds, chattels and food of every kind should be brought together and burned to ashes with consuming fire, so that the whole region north of Humber might be stripped of all means of sustenance. Modern historians estimate that the population of Yorkshire fell by as much as 75% in the decades following the harrying. The campaign achieved its strategic objective. Northern England never again posed a serious threat to Norman rule, but at a cost that stained William's reputation for centuries. The Norman conquest introduced feudalism to England in its most systematic form. Unlike the gradual evolution of feudal relationships in continental Europe, England experienced a complete feudal revolution imposed from above by royal decree. William's genius lay in his ability to combine Norman feudal practices with Anglo-Saxon administrative efficiency. He retained the sophisticated Anglo-Saxon system of royal government, the chancery, the treasury, and the network of royal officials, while overlaying it with Norman feudal obligations. The redistribution of land was total and systematic. By 1086, only 2 major Anglo-Saxon landholders retained their estates, and Norman and French nobles controlled over 95% of England's wealth. This wasn't random confiscation, but careful political engineering designed to create a new ruling class bound to the crown by feudal obligations. William's followers received their English estates not as free gifts, but as fiefs held in return for specific military obligations. Each major tenant-in-chief owed the crown a fixed number of knights for royal service, creating a military system that could mobilise thousands of heavy cavalry at the king's command. The introduction of castle building revolutionised English military architecture and social relationships. Within 20 years of the conquest, hundreds of motte and bailey castles dotted the English landscape, serving as symbols of Norman authority and bases for local control. These castles weren't just military installations, but administrative centres that projected royal power into every corner of the kingdom. William's greatest administrative achievement was the Domesday Survey of 1086, the most comprehensive census undertaken in medieval Europe. The survey recorded the ownership, value and resources of virtually every piece of land in England, creating a detailed picture of the kingdom's wealth and population. The survey's scope was unprecedented. Royal commissioners travelled to every county questioning local juries under oath about land ownership, population, livestock and agricultural resources. The resulting record, compiled in 2 volumes known as Domesday Book, provided the Crown with detailed information about its kingdom's resources and tax potential. The survey revealed the extent of the Norman transformation. In 1066, Anglo-Saxon nobles had controlled the vast majority of England's wealth. By 1086, Norman and French nobles held over 95% of the land, while the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy had been almost entirely eliminated. Only 2 major Anglo-Saxon landholders, Thorkel of Arden and Coleswine of Lincoln, retained significant estates. The Domesday Survey also demonstrated the sophistication of Norman administration. The ability to conduct such a comprehensive census required an efficient bureaucracy, standardised procedures and effective communication networks. The survey showed that Norman England had inherited and improved upon the administrative systems that had made Anglo-Saxon England the most efficiently governed kingdom in Europe. The economic data revealed in Domesday Book painted a picture of a prosperous but heavily exploited kingdom. The total value of England was assessed at approximately £73,000 per year, an enormous sum that made England one of the wealthiest kingdoms in Europe. However, this wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small Norman elite, while the Anglo-Saxon population had been reduced to the status of peasants and serfs. The Norman conquest transformed the English church as completely as it transformed secular society. William replaced virtually every Anglo-Saxon bishop and abbot with Norman or continental appointees, introducing new architectural styles, liturgical practices, and administrative methods. Lanfranc, the Italian scholar whom William appointed as Archbishop of Canterbury, embodied this ecclesiastical revolution. A former prior of Bec Abbey in Normandy and a renowned theologian, Lanfranc brought continental learning and Gregorian reform principles to England. He reorganised the English church along Norman lines, established new cathedral schools, and strengthened papal connections. The architectural transformation was equally dramatic. The Normans demolished most Anglo-Saxon churches and replaced them with massive stone structures in the new Romanesque style. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, pioneered the use of ribbed vaulting and pointed arches that would later influence Gothic architecture. These new churches weren't just religious buildings, but symbols of Norman power and cultural superiority. Norman ecclesiastical policy was pragmatic rather than purely spiritual. The church served as an instrument of royal government, with bishops and abbots functioning as royal administrators as well as spiritual leaders. This integration of secular and religious authority strengthened royal power while ensuring that the church supported Norman rule. The Norman conquest created a linguistic revolution that would permanently alter the English language. Norman French became the language of government, law, and high culture, while English was relegated to the status of a peasant tongue. This linguistic divide reflected and reinforced the social hierarchy that the conquest had created. For nearly 3 centuries, England was effectively bilingual, with Norman French dominating official discourse and English surviving in popular culture. Legal proceedings were conducted in French, royal documents were written in Latin or French, and literature was composed primarily in French. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which had recorded English history for centuries, gradually declined and finally ceased in the mid-12th century. However, this linguistic conquest was not complete. English survived and eventually absorbed thousands of French words, creating the hybrid language that would become modern English. The Norman conquest enriched English vocabulary enormously, particularly in areas of government, law, military affairs, and culture. Words like government, parliament, justice, army, and culture itself are Norman French in origin. The cultural transformation extended beyond language to encompass art, architecture, literature, and social customs. Norman artistic styles replaced Anglo-Saxon traditions, continental fashions displaced English customs, and French literary forms superseded Anglo-Saxon poetry. The rich tradition of Anglo-Saxon manuscript illumination gave way to Norman architectural sculpture and continental manuscript styles. William the Conqueror's death in 1087 precipitated a succession crisis that revealed the tensions within the Norman settlement. The Conqueror had divided his lands between his sons. Robert Curthose received Normandy, William Rufus became King of England, and Henry received a substantial monetary inheritance. This division violated the principle of primogeniture and created immediate conflicts. Robert and William Rufus each claimed the other's inheritance, leading to decades of warfare that drained both kingdoms' resources. The division also encouraged rebellions by Norman nobles who held lands on both sides of the Channel and preferred a single ruler who could protect their interests. William Rufus, 1087 to 1100, was a capable but unpopular king whose reign was marked by constant warfare and heavy taxation. His conflicts with the church, particularly with Archbishop Anselm over investiture rights, created additional tensions. Rufus's sudden death in a hunting accident in the New Forest, possibly assassination, brought his younger brother Henry to the throne. Henry I's seizure of the crown in 1100 demonstrated the continuing instability of Norman rule. Henry moved quickly to secure his position, issuing a Charter of Liberties that promised to remedy the abuses of his brother's reign and marrying Matilda, a descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal house. This marriage was politically brilliant, giving Henry's children a claim to Anglo-Saxon legitimacy, while reassuring the English population that their traditions were not entirely forgotten. Henry I's death in 1135 without a male heir precipitated the greatest crisis of the Norman period. The king had designated his daughter Matilda as his successor, but medieval England was not ready for a female ruler. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the throne with the support of the church and many Norman nobles who preferred a male king to a woman. The resulting civil war, known as the Anarchy, lasted from 1135 to 1153 and nearly destroyed the Norman achievement. England was divided between supporters of Stephen and Matilda, with control of territory shifting constantly as nobles changed sides based on immediate advantage rather than principle. The conflict was particularly destructive because both sides employed mercenary armies that lived off the land, devastating the countryside and terrorizing the population. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's final entry, describing Stephen's reign, painted a picture of unprecedented suffering. They filled the land full of castles. They greatly oppressed the wretched people by making them work at these castles, and when the castles were finished, they filled them with devils and evil men. The war's most significant consequence was the weakening of royal authority and the strengthening of baronial power. Local nobles built unauthorized castles, raised private armies, and governed their territories as independent principalities. The sophisticated administrative system that the Normans had inherited from the Anglo-Saxons began to break down as central authority collapsed. The resolution of the succession crisis came through compromise rather than military victory. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 recognised Stephen as king for life, but designated Matilda's son Henry as his heir. Stephen's death the following year brought Henry II to the throne, founding the Angevin dynasty that would rule England for over 3 centuries. Henry II's accession marked the beginning of a new phase in English history. Through his mother, he inherited the Norman claim to England. Through his father, Geoffrey of Anjou, he controlled Anjou and Maine. And through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he acquired vast territories in southwestern France. The result was an empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The Angevin Empire represented both the culmination and the transformation of the Norman achievement. The Normans had conquered England and created a cross-channel realm, but the Angevins expanded this into a European empire that made England part of a larger continental system. This expansion would bring both opportunities and challenges that would shape English development for centuries. The Norman period fundamentally transformed England in ways that would influence its development for centuries. The introduction of feudalism created new social relationships based on land tenure and military service. The replacement of the Anglo-Saxon elite with Norman nobles established a new ruling class with continental connections and perspectives. The administrative revolution was equally important. The Normans combined their own governmental innovations with Anglo-Saxon administrative efficiency, creating a system of royal government that was more sophisticated than anything else in medieval Europe. The development of the exchequer, the expansion of royal justice, and the creation of a professional bureaucracy laid the foundations for the strong monarchical government that would characterize medieval England. The cultural transformation was profound but incomplete. While Norman French became the language of the elite, English survived among the common people and eventually reasserted itself. The result was a hybrid culture that combined Norman, Anglo-Saxon, and continental elements in unique ways. The Norman conquest also connected England more closely to continental Europe. Norman nobles held lands in both England and France, creating cross-channel networks of kinship, trade, and cultural exchange. English scholars studied in continental schools, English merchants traded in continental markets, and English armies fought in continental wars. Perhaps most importantly, the Norman conquest established patterns of government and society that would enable England's later expansion. The strong monarchical government, the efficient administrative system, and the military innovations introduced by the Normans provided the foundation for the medieval English kingdom that would eventually build a global empire. The Norman period was thus both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of Anglo-Saxon England and the beginning of a new phase in English development. The Normans had not simply conquered England, they had created a new kind of English kingdom that combined the best elements of Norman and Anglo-Saxon civilization while remaining open to continental influences and innovations. When Henry II ascended the English throne in 1154 at the age of 21, he inherited not just a kingdom, but the fragments of what would become the largest empire in medieval Europe. Through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and conquest, Henry controlled territories stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. The Angevin Empire, as historians later termed it, was a revolutionary political entity. Unlike previous medieval kingdoms, which were essentially collections of local lordships held together by personal loyalty, Henry's empire was a sophisticated administrative state with standardized legal systems, professional bureaucracies, and efficient communication networks. Henry's inheritance was complex and potentially unstable. From his mother Matilda, he claimed England and Normandy. From his father Geoffrey of Anjou, he inherited Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 brought him control of Aquitaine and Gascony, making him master of more French territory than the French king himself. This vast inheritance required extraordinary administrative and military skills to hold together. Henry proved equal to the challenge, spending his 35-year reign constantly travelling between his territories, suppressing rebellions, reforming legal systems, and expanding royal authority. He was said to be always on horseback, moving so rapidly between his domains that his courtiers complained they could barely keep up. Henry's first task was to restore royal authority in England after the chaos of Stephen's reign. The anarchy had left England with hundreds of unauthorised castles, private armies, and local nobles who had grown accustomed to governing their territories independently. Henry's response was systematic and ruthless. The new king ordered the destruction of over 1,000 unauthorized castles built during Stephen's reign. Those who resisted faced royal armies equipped with the latest siege technology. Henry's use of mercenary troops, particularly Welsh archers and Flemish crossbowmen, gave him military advantages that few nobles could match. The restoration of royal justice was equally important. Henry expanded the system of royal courts, sending itinerant justices throughout the kingdom to hear cases and enforce royal law. This not only strengthened royal authority, but also provided the crown with substantial revenues from court fees and fines. Henry's legal reforms were revolutionary in their scope and impact. The development of common law, a standardized legal system that applied throughout the kingdom, replaced the patchwork of local customs and baronial courts that had characterized earlier periods. Legal procedures were standardized, written records were maintained, and professional judges replaced local nobles in most legal proceedings. The most dramatic crisis of Henry's reign arose from his conflict with Thomas Becket, whom he had appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Henry expected Becket, his former chancellor and close friend, to support royal policies regarding church-state relations. Instead, Becket became a fierce defender of ecclesiastical independence and papal authority. The conflict centred on the constitutions of Clarendon, 1164, Henry's attempt to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical authority. The king demanded that clergy accused of crimes be tried in royal courts rather than church courts that appeals to Rome require royal permission, and that bishops swear fealty to the crown before receiving papal confirmation. Becket's resistance to these demands created a crisis that lasted for 6 years. The archbishop fled to France in 1164, where he remained in exile under papal protection while conducting a propaganda war against Henry's policies. The conflict became a Europe-wide controversy, with the Pope supporting Becket and other rulers watching to see whether royal or ecclesiastical authority would prevail. The crisis reached its climax in December 1170, when 4 knights, believing they were acting on Henry's wishes, murdered Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. The assassination shocked medieval Europe and transformed Becket into a martyr whose shrine became one of the most popular pilgrimage destinations in Christendom. Henry's public penance at Becket's tomb in 1174 was one of the most dramatic scenes in medieval history. The king walked barefoot through Canterbury's streets, knelt at Becket's shrine, and submitted to being flogged by the cathedral's monks. This humiliation was politically necessary to restore Henry's reputation and prevent papal excommunication, but it also demonstrated the limits of royal power in medieval Europe. Despite the Becket controversy, Henry's legal reforms fundamentally transformed English society. The development of common law created a unified legal system that was more sophisticated and efficient than anything else in medieval Europe. Royal courts offered faster, fairer, and more predictable justice than local baronial courts, leading to a massive increase in litigation. The introduction of standardized legal procedures revolutionized property law, criminal justice, and commercial relationships. Writs, standardized legal documents that initiated court proceedings, made legal remedies available to a much broader segment of the population. The development of jury trials, initially for property disputes but later extended to criminal cases, introduced new concepts of evidence and proof. Henry's legal innovations had profound social consequences. The expansion of royal justice weakened the power of local nobles while strengthening the position of free peasants and merchants who could now appeal to royal courts for protection. The development of written legal records created a new class of professional lawyers and clerks who served royal administration. The influence of English common law extended far beyond medieval England. The legal principles and procedures developed during Henry's reign would later be exported to English colonies around the world, forming the basis for legal systems in the United States, Canada, Australia, and dozens of other countries. Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most important political alliances of the medieval period, but it was also one of the most turbulent. Eleanor was one of the most remarkable women of the Middle Ages, a patron of troubadours, a leader of the Second Crusade, and a political power in her own right, who outlived 2 husbands and most of her children. The marriage brought Henry control of Aquitaine and Gascony, but it also imported the sophisticated court culture of southern France into the Angevin Empire. Eleanor's court became a centre of courtly love poetry, chivalric romance and artistic innovation that influenced European culture for centuries. However, the marriage deteriorated as Henry's infidelities and authoritarian tendencies clashed with Eleanor's independent spirit. The crisis came in 1173 when Eleanor supported their son's rebellion against their father. Henry's response was swift and decisive. He imprisoned Eleanor for the next 16 years, effectively removing her from political life. Eleanor's imprisonment demonstrated both Henry's ruthlessness and the limitations of female power in medieval society. Despite her wealth, intelligence, and political connections, Eleanor could be neutralized by a husband who controlled the military and administrative apparatus of the state. The rebellion of Henry's sons in 1173-1174 was the greatest crisis of his reign and revealed the inherent instability of the Angevin Empire. Henry the young king, Richard, later the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany, supported by their mother Eleanor, the French King Louis VII, and various discontented nobles launched a coordinated attack on Henry's authority. The rebellion was motivated by the sons' frustration with their father's refusal to grant them real power in their designated territories. Henry had crowned his eldest son as co-king but refused to give him actual authority, creating a situation that bred resentment and ambition. The scale of the rebellion was enormous, with fighting occurring simultaneously in England, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Henry faced enemies on multiple fronts while dealing with internal revolts by English nobles who saw an opportunity to regain the independence they had lost during his early reign. Henry's victory demonstrated his exceptional military and political skills. He defeated his enemies through a combination of rapid movement, superior resources, and diplomatic cunning. The capture of Eleanor and the submission of his sons ended the immediate crisis, but the underlying tensions that had caused the rebellion remained unresolved. Henry's death in 1189 brought Richard III to the throne, beginning one of the most romanticised but problematic reigns in English history. Richard spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England, preferring to pursue military glory in the Holy Land and defend his continental territories against French expansion. Richard's participation in the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, made him a legendary figure in medieval literature, but it was a strategic disaster for the Angevin Empire. The enormous costs of crusading, combined with Richard's absence from his territories, weakened royal authority and strengthened the position of local nobles and the French king. The Third Crusade was launched in response to Saladin's conquest of Jerusalem in 1187. Richard joined forces with Philip Augustus of France and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany in what was intended to be a coordinated effort to reclaim the Holy Land. However, the crusade was plagued by rivalries between its leaders and logistical difficulties that prevented decisive action. Richard's military achievements in the Holy Land were impressive but ultimately futile. He won significant victories at Arsuf and Jaffa, demonstrating the tactical superiority of Western heavy cavalry when properly deployed. His siege of Acre was successful, though marred by his massacre of Muslim prisoners. However, he failed to recapture Jerusalem, the Crusade's primary objective. The Crusade's most lasting consequence was the massive debt it imposed on the Angevin Empire. Richard's crusading expenses, estimated at over 100,000 marks, required unprecedented taxation that strained the loyalty of his subjects. The sale of offices, privileges, and even entire counties to raise crusading funds weakened royal administration and created long-term financial problems. Richard's capture by Leopold of Austria on his return journey created an additional crisis. The enormous ransom demanded for his release, 150,000 marks, equivalent to 3 years' royal revenue, required another round of crushing taxation that further alienated his subjects. Richard's death in 1129 brought his brother John to the throne, beginning the most disastrous reign in Angevin history. John faced immediate challenges from his nephew Arthur of Brittany, who claimed the throne with French support, and from Philip Augustus of France, who was determined to expel the Angevins from their French territories. John's character was ill-suited to these challenges. Unlike his father and brother, who were charismatic military leaders, John was suspicious, cruel, and politically inept. His murder of Arthur in 1203 shocked contemporary opinion and provided Philip Augustus with the pretext he needed for a full-scale invasion of Angevin territories. The loss of Normandy in 1204 was a catastrophe that fundamentally altered the character of the English kingdom. The duchy that had been the original base of Norman power fell to French forces after a brief campaign that revealed the weakness of John's military position and the disloyalty of his Norman subjects. The fall of Normandy had profound consequences for English development. The loss of continental territories forced English kings to focus more attention on their island kingdom, accelerating the development of distinctively English institutions and identity. The Norman nobles who lost their French lands became more thoroughly English, while those who chose to retain their French properties were forced to abandon their English estates. John's attempts to recover his lost territories led to a series of military and diplomatic failures that bankrupted the royal treasury and alienated the English nobility. The disastrous Battle of Bouvines in 1214, where John's coalition was decisively defeated by Philip Augustus, marked the end of realistic hopes for recovering the Angevin Empire. The financial demands of John's failed campaigns created unprecedented tensions between the crown and the nobility. Traditional feudal obligations were stretched beyond recognition as John demanded scutage, money payments in lieu of military service, at rates far exceeding customary levels. The king's arbitrary taxation, seizure of noble estates, and use of foreign mercenaries created a coalition of opposition that transcended traditional factional divisions. The rebellion that began in 1215 was different from previous baronial revolts. Rather than seeking to replace John with another king, the rebels demanded constitutional limitations on royal power. Their programme: influenced by canon law, Roman law, and emerging concepts of natural rights, represented a revolutionary challenge to traditional monarchical authority. The rebels' capture of London in May 1215 forced John to negotiate. The resulting document, sealed at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, would become known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter that established fundamental principles of constitutional government. Magna Carta was not intended as a democratic document or a declaration of universal rights. It was a feudal agreement designed to protect the interests of the nobility and the church against royal abuse. However, its principles would later be interpreted more broadly, making it one of the foundational documents of constitutional government. The Charter's 63 clauses address specific grievances against John's rule while establishing general principles that would influence constitutional development for centuries. The most famous clause, number 39, stated that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This principle of due process was revolutionary in its implications. It established that even kings were subject to law, and that legal procedures must be followed before anyone could be punished. While initially applied only to free men, excluding serfs and villains, the principle would later be extended to all subjects. Other important provisions included limitations on taxation. The king could not impose taxes without consent, protection of church rights, standardization of weights and measures, and restrictions on the abuse of royal officials. The Charter also established a committee of 25 barons with the right to rebel if the king violated its provisions, an early form of constitutional enforcement. The immediate impact of Magna Carta was limited. John repudiated the Charter within months, leading to renewed civil war that lasted until his death in 1216. However, the Charter was reissued by John's successors and gradually became accepted as fundamental law that bound all future kings. John's death in 1216 brought his 9-year-old son Henry III to the throne under the regency of William Marshal, one of the greatest knights of the medieval period. The minority government faced the immediate challenge of ending the civil war while establishing the legitimacy of the new king. The regency's decision to reissue Magna Carta in 1216 and 1217 was politically brilliant. By accepting constitutional limitations on royal power, the government won the support of moderate nobles while isolating the rebels who continued to fight with French support. The defeat of the French invasion force at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217 effectively ended the Civil War. William Marshal's regency, 1216 to 1219, was one of the most successful minority governments in medieval history. The old knight, who had served 4 kings with unwavering loyalty, provided stability and continuity during a critical period. His death in 1219 was mourned throughout England as the passing of an age of chivalric honour. The transition to Henry's personal rule in 1227 revealed the continuing tensions within the English political system. Henry was pious, artistic, and well-intentioned, but he lacked the political skills necessary to manage the complex relationships between crown, nobility, and church that characterised 13th century government. Henry III's long reign, 1216 to 1272, was marked by recurring conflicts with his nobility over taxation, foreign policy, and royal administration. The king's preference for foreign advisors, his expensive and unsuccessful attempts to recover lost continental territories, and his support for papal policies that drained English resources created persistent opposition. The crisis came to a head in 1258 when a group of nobles led by Simon de Montfort forced Henry to accept the provisions of Oxford, which established a council of nobles to oversee royal government. This was a more radical limitation of royal power than anything in Magna Carta, effectively making the king a constitutional monarch subject to baronial oversight. The resulting conflict, known as the Barons' War, 1264 to 1267, was both a civil war and a constitutional revolution. Simon de Montfort's victory at the Battle of Lewes in 1264 made him the effective ruler of England, but his radical policies and reliance on popular support alienated moderate nobles. De Montfort's most significant innovation was the parliament he summoned in 1265, which included not only nobles and clergy, but also representatives from towns and counties. This was the first English parliament to include commoners, establishing a precedent that would evolve into the House of Commons. The defeat and death of de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265 ended the immediate crisis, but the constitutional issues he had raised remained unresolved. The principle that the king needed consent for taxation and major policy decisions had been established, even if the mechanisms for obtaining that consent remained unclear. The Angevin period fundamentally transformed England from a Norman conquest state into a sophisticated European kingdom with distinctive institutions and identity. The development of common law, the establishment of professional royal administration, and the emergence of constitutional limitations on royal power created the framework for England's later political development. The loss of the Continental Empire, while traumatic at the time, ultimately benefited English development. Freed from the burden of defending scattered territories across France, English kings could focus their resources on developing their island kingdom. The nobility, no longer divided between English and French loyalties, became more thoroughly English in outlook and interests. The Angevin legal revolution had lasting global impact. The common law system developed during this period would later be exported to English colonies around the world, forming the basis for legal systems in dozens of countries. The principles of due process, trial by jury, and the rule of law established during the Angevin period became fundamental elements of constitutional government. Perhaps most importantly, the Angevin period established the principle that royal power was limited by law and custom. Magna Carta and the constitutional conflicts of Henry III's reign created precedents that would be invoked by later generations seeking to limit monarchical authority. The idea that even kings were subject to law became a fundamental principle of English political culture. The Angevin Empire had failed as a political entity, but its institutional and cultural legacy would shape English development for centuries. The sophisticated governmental systems, legal innovations, and constitutional principles developed during this period provided the foundation for the medieval English kingdom that would eventually build a global empire far larger and more durable than anything the Angevins had achieved. Edward I's accession to the throne in 1272 marked the beginning of a new phase in English history, characterised by aggressive expansion, military innovation, and the systematic attempt to create a unified British kingdom under English rule. Known to posterity as Longshanks for his imposing height and the Hammer of the Scots for his relentless campaigns against Scottish independence, Edward was perhaps the most formidable warrior king in English history. Edward's vision was nothing less than the creation of a British Empire under English hegemony. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on their continental possessions, Edward turned his attention to the Celtic periphery of the British Isles. His campaigns in Wales and Scotland were not mere raids for plunder, but systematic attempts at conquest and integration that would fundamentally alter the political geography of Britain. The new king brought to these campaigns military innovations that revolutionized medieval warfare. Edward's armies were the first to make systematic use of the longbow, a weapon that would dominate European battlefields for the next 2 centuries. His siege trains included the most advanced artillery of the age, including massive trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones. Most importantly, Edward understood the importance of logistics, supply lines, and coordinated campaigns that combined land and sea operations. Wales in the 13th century was a patchwork of competing principalities, the most powerful being Gwynedd under Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, who styled himself Prince of Wales. Llywelyn had taken advantage of the chaos during Henry III's reign to expand his authority over much of Wales, creating the most unified Welsh state since the Roman period. The conflict between Edward and Llywelyn was inevitable. The Welsh prince refused to pay homage to the English king and allied himself with Simon de Montfort during the Barons' War. More provocatively, Llywelyn married Eleanor de Montfort, Simon's daughter, creating a symbolic link between Welsh independence and English constitutional opposition. Edward's first Welsh campaign in 1277 demonstrated his strategic brilliance. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the mountainous heartland of Gwynedd, Edward used his naval superiority to cut off Anglesey, the granary of Wales that supplied Llywelyn's forces. Simultaneously, English armies advanced along the coast while a fleet of ships from the Cinque Ports controlled the sea approaches. The campaign was a masterpiece of medieval logistics. Edward's forces built roads as they advanced, established supply depots and constructed a network of castles to secure conquered territory. The systematic nature of the conquest was unprecedented in medieval warfare and demonstrated Edward's understanding that permanent conquest required permanent occupation. Llywelyn's submission in 1277 was temporary. The harsh terms imposed by the Treaty of Aberconwy, which reduced the Prince of Wales to a minor lordship in western Gwynedd, created resentment that exploded into rebellion in 1282. This time, Edward's response was total war aimed at the complete destruction of Welsh independence. The Second Welsh War was marked by unprecedented brutality. Edward's forces systematically destroyed Welsh strongholds, devastated the countryside, and hunted down the Welsh leadership. The death of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd in a skirmish near Builthwells in December 1282 effectively ended organised Welsh resistance, though guerrilla warfare continued for several more years. Edward's conquest of Wales was secured by one of the most impressive castle-building programmes in medieval history. The iron ring of fortifications that Edward constructed around the Welsh heartland represented the cutting edge of military architecture and demonstrated the enormous resources that the English crown could mobilise. Caernarfon Castle, begun in 1283, was designed not just as a military stronghold, but as a symbol of English imperial authority. Its polygonal towers and banded masonry deliberately echoed the walls of Constantinople, proclaiming Edward's status as a new Constantine ruling a new empire. The castle's Eagle Tower, where Edward's son, the future Edward II, was born, became the symbolic birthplace of the English Prince of Wales. Harlech Castle, perched on a rocky outcrop overlooking Cardigan Bay, was considered virtually impregnable and served as the administrative centre for Edward's new principality. Conway Castle controlled the vital crossing of the River Conway, while Beaumaris Castle on Anglesey represented the pinnacle of concentric castle design. These castles were not just military installations, but centres of English colonisation. Each was accompanied by a planned town populated by English settlers who enjoyed special privileges and legal protections. The Welsh population was systematically excluded from these new urban centres, creating a colonial society that would persist for centuries. The cost of Edward's Welsh castles was enormous. Modern estimates suggest they consumed over £80,000, equivalent to several years' royal revenue. However, the investment was strategically sound. The castle secured English control of Wales for centuries and provided bases for future campaigns in Scotland and Ireland. Edward's intervention in Scottish affairs began with a succession dispute that seemed to offer an opportunity for peaceful expansion of English influence. The death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286, followed by that of his heir Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, left Scotland without a clear successor. The competing claims of John Balliol and Robert Bruce, grandfather of the future king, created a crisis that threatened to plunge Scotland into civil war. The Scottish magnates, seeking to avoid bloodshed, invited Edward to arbitrate the dispute as overlord of Scotland, a decision that would have momentous consequences for Scottish independence. Edward's arbitration was legally sound but politically disastrous for Scotland. His choice of John Balliol as king was based on solid feudal law, but his insistence that Balliol acknowledge English overlordship transformed Scotland from an independent kingdom into an English vassal state. The humiliation of the Scottish king, mockingly called Tomb Tabard, empty coat, created resentment that would fuel centuries of Anglo-Scottish warfare. The crisis came when Edward demanded Scottish military service for his campaigns in France. The Scottish Parliament's refusal and their alliance with France in 1295, the beginning of the Old Alliance that would last for centuries, provided Edward with the pretext he needed for the conquest of Scotland. Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1296 was swift and devastating. The sack of Berwick, where English forces massacred thousands of civilians, demonstrated Edward's determination to crush Scottish resistance through terror. The defeat of Scottish forces at Dunbar and the capture of John Balliol effectively ended the first phase of Scottish resistance. Edward's removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey to Westminster was a calculated insult, designed to demonstrate that Scottish kingship itself had been extinguished. The stone upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries became a trophy of English conquest and a symbol of Scottish subjugation. However, Edward's triumph proved temporary. The rebellion that began in 1297 under William Wallace demonstrated that conquest and occupation were different things. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge, where a Scottish army destroyed a much larger English force through superior tactics and local knowledge, showed that English military superiority was not absolute. Wallace's rebellion was more than a military uprising. It was a war of national liberation that appealed to all levels of Scottish society. The Guardian of Scotland, as Wallace styled himself, represented a new kind of leadership that transcended traditional feudal loyalties and appealed directly to Scottish national identity. Edward's arbitration was legally sound but politically disastrous for Scotland. His choice of John Balliol as king was based on solid feudal law, But his insistence that Balliol acknowledge English overlordship transformed Scotland from an independent kingdom into an English vassal state. The humiliation of the Scottish king, mockingly called Tomb Tabard, empty coat, created resentment that would fuel centuries of Anglo-Scottish warfare. The crisis came when Edward demanded Scottish military service for his campaigns in France. The Scottish Parliament's refusal and their alliance with France in 1295, the beginning of the Auld Alliance that would last for centuries, provided Edward with the pretext he needed for the conquest of Scotland. Edward's invasion of Scotland in 1296 was swift and devastating. The sack of Berwick, where English forces massacred thousands of civilians, demonstrated Edward's determination to crush Scottish resistance through terror. The defeat of Scottish forces at Dunbar and the capture of John Balliol effectively ended the first phase of Scottish resistance. Edward's removal of the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey to Westminster was a calculated insult designed to demonstrate that Scottish kingship itself had been extinguished. The stone upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries became a trophy of English conquest and a symbol of Scottish subjugation. However, Edward's triumph proved temporary. The rebellion that began in 1297 under William Wallace demonstrated that conquest and occupation were different things. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge, where a Scottish army destroyed a much larger English force through superior tactics and local knowledge, showed that English military superiority was not absolute. Wallace's rebellion was more than a military uprising. It was a war of national liberation that appealed to all levels of Scottish society. The Guardian of Scotland, as Wallace styled himself, represented a new kind of leadership that transcended traditional feudal loyalties and appealed directly to Scottish national identity. Edward's response to Wallace's rebellion was characteristically systematic and brutal. The king personally led a massive army north in 1298, determined to crush Scottish resistance once and for all. The Battle of Falkirk demonstrated both English military superiority and the limitations of Scottish resistance. Wallace's schiltrons, formations of spearmen, initially held firm against English cavalry charges, but the devastating fire of English longbowmen ultimately broke Scottish resistance. Wallace's capture and execution in 1305 was designed as a public spectacle to deter future rebellion. The Scottish leader was hanged, drawn and quartered in London, with parts of his body displayed in Scottish towns as a warning. However, this brutality only strengthened Scottish determination to resist English rule. The emergence of Robert the Bruce as a claimant to the Scottish throne in 1306 marked the beginning of the final phase of the Scottish Wars of Independence. Bruce's claim was complicated by his family's previous support for Edward I and his own participation in English campaigns against Scotland. His murder of John Comyn, his rival for the throne in Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, was both a political necessity and a sacrilege that complicated his position. Bruce's early campaigns were disasters, defeated repeatedly by English forces and abandoned by many Scottish nobles. He was reduced to guerrilla warfare in the Scottish Highlands. The famous story of Bruce and the spider, while probably legendary, captures the persistence that characterised his eventual triumph. The turning point came with Edward I's death in 1307. The new king, Edward II, lacked his father's military genius and political determination. Bruce exploited this weakness to gradually reconquer Scotland through a combination of guerrilla tactics, diplomatic skill, and the systematic reduction of English strongholds. The siege of Stirling Castle in 1314 forced Edward II to attempt the relief of this crucial stronghold. The resulting Battle of Bannockburn was one of the most decisive victories in Scottish history. Bruce's tactical brilliance, combined with English overconfidence and poor leadership, resulted in the destruction of the largest English army ever assembled for a Scottish campaign. Bannockburn was more than a military victory, it was a declaration of Scottish independence that resonated throughout Europe. Bruce's subsequent campaigns in northern England and Ireland demonstrated that Scotland had not merely survived English conquest but had become a formidable military power in its own right. The Declaration of Arbroath, sent to Pope John XVIII in 1320, was one of the most remarkable documents of medieval political thought. Written in the name of the Scottish nobility but clearly influenced by Bruce's political vision, the Declaration articulated principles of national sovereignty and popular consent that were centuries ahead of their time. The Declaration's most famous passage, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up but with life itself," became a foundational text of Scottish national identity. More importantly, the Declaration argued that kings ruled by consent of their people and could be deposed if they failed in their duties. This was a revolutionary concept in an age of divine right monarchy and would later influence constitutional thought throughout Europe and America. While Edward I had focused on British expansion, his grandson Edward III turned his attention back to the continent, launching the series of conflicts known as the 100 Years' War. Edward's claim to the French throne through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, provided the legal justification for what became the longest and most destructive war in medieval European history. The war's origins lay in the complex feudal relationships that bound the English and French crowns. As Duke of Aquitaine, the English king owed homage to the French king, creating a situation where one sovereign was technically the vassal of another. This relationship became intolerable when Philip VI of France attempted to confiscate Aquitaine in 1337. Edward's response was to assert his claim to the French throne itself, arguing that his hereditary right superseded Philip's election by the French peers. This claim, while legally questionable, provided a rallying point for English nationalism and justified a war of conquest that would consume English resources for over a century. Edward III's invasion of France in 1346 demonstrated the military innovations that would characterise English warfare for the next century. The English army that landed in Normandy was smaller than traditional feudal hosts, but more professional, disciplined and tactically sophisticated than anything seen in medieval Europe. The key to English success was the longbow, a weapon that had evolved from Welsh hunting bows into a formidable military instrument. English longbowmen could loose 12 arrows per minute with accuracy up to 200 yards, creating a rate of fire that could devastate cavalry charges and infantry formations alike. The Battle of Crecy on August 26, 1346 revolutionised medieval warfare. Philip VI's army, which included the flower of French chivalry and Genoese crossbowmen, was destroyed by English longbowmen fighting from prepared positions. The death of King John of Bohemia and thousands of French nobles demonstrated that traditional heavy cavalry was obsolete against disciplined missile troops. The siege of Calais that followed Crecy was equally significant. Edward's year-long blockade of this crucial port demonstrated English naval superiority and logistical capabilities. The capture of Calais provided England with a permanent foothold in France that would last for over 2 centuries. The arrival of the Black Death in England in 1348 interrupted the French War and created social upheavals that would transform English society. The plague, which killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of England's population, created labour shortages that fundamentally altered the relationship between lords and peasants. The Statute of Labourers, 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, was largely unenforceable in the face of economic reality. Peasants could demand higher wages, better working conditions and greater personal freedom because their labour had become scarce and valuable. The social tensions created by the plague culminated in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the largest popular uprising in English history. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the rebels demanded the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of rents and the punishment of corrupt officials. The revolt's temporary success, the rebels occupied London and forced the young Richard II to negotiate, demonstrated the potential power of popular movements. Although the rebellion was ultimately crushed and its leaders executed, it marked the beginning of the end for serfdom in England. The resumption of the French war under Henry V marked the high point of English military achievement in the medieval period. Henry's invasion of France in 1415 was meticulously planned and brilliantly executed, demonstrating that the lessons of earlier campaigns had been thoroughly absorbed. The Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415 was perhaps the most famous English victory of the medieval period. Henry's army, exhausted by disease and outnumbered by at least 3-1, destroyed a French force that included the greatest nobles of France. The battle demonstrated once again the tactical superiority of English longbowmen and the effectiveness of defensive positions against cavalry charges, and Henry's subsequent conquest of Normandy was systematic and thorough. Unlike earlier English campaigns, which had focused on raids and quick victories, Henry's strategy aimed at permanent occupation and administrative control. The Treaty of Troyes, 1420, which recognised Henry as heir to the French throne, seemed to promise the unification of England and France under English rule. However, Henry's death in 1422 and the emergence of Joan of Arc as a French national leader transformed the character of the war. Joan's relief of Orléans in 1429 and her role in the coronation of Charles VII at Reims demonstrated that French resistance was far from crushed. The appearance of Joan of Arc marked a turning point in both the 100 Years' War and the development of European nationalism. This peasant girl from Lorraine, claiming divine visions that commanded her to drive the English from France, embodied a new kind of popular nationalism that transcended traditional feudal loyalties. Joan's military achievements were remarkable but brief. Her relief of Orléans broke the English siege that had threatened to complete their conquest of central France. Her subsequent victories at Jargeau and Patay demonstrated that English military superiority was not absolute, and that French forces could defeat English armies under the right circumstances. More importantly, Joan's success revitalised French morale and provided a focus for national resistance. Her insistence that Charles VII be crowned at Reims, the traditional coronation site of French kings, was a brilliant piece of political theatre that legitimised French resistance and undermined English claims to sovereignty. Joan's capture by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430 and her subsequent trial and execution for heresy were intended to discredit her mission and demoralise French resistance. Instead, her martyrdom strengthened French resolve and provided a powerful symbol of national independence that would inspire French resistance for centuries. The end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453, with the loss of all English territories in France except Calais, created a crisis that would tear England apart for the next 30 years. The Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York, were both a dynastic struggle and a broader conflict over the nature of royal authority and noble power. The war's origins lay in the weak kingship of Henry VI, whose mental instability and political incompetence created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles rushed to fill. The king's periodic bouts of madness, combined with military disasters in France and financial crisis at home, undermined royal authority and encouraged factional conflict. The Duke of York's claim to the throne, based on his descent from Edward III through both male and female lines, challenged the Lancastrian dynasty's legitimacy and provided a focus for opposition to Henry VI's government. The Duke's appointment as protector during the king's periods of madness gave him a taste of power that he was reluctant to surrender. The First Battle of St Albans in 1455 marked the beginning of open warfare between the factions. The Yorkist victory and the capture of Henry VI demonstrated that the royal government could be defeated by determined opposition, encouraging further challenges to royal authority. The most powerful figure in the early phases of the Wars of the Roses was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, whose wealth, military skill and political connections earned him the nickname the Kingmaker. Warwick's ability to raise armies, control key fortresses and influence noble opinion made him the arbiter of English politics for over a decade. Warwick's support was crucial to Yorkist success in the early 1460s. His victory at the Battle of Towton in 1461, fought in a blizzard that gave his archers a decisive advantage, was the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. An estimated 28,000 men died in a single day, decimating the English nobility and demonstrating the destructive potential of civil war. Edward IV's coronation in 1461 seemed to end the Lancastrian cause, but Warwick's subsequent quarrel with the king he had made created new instabilities. The Earl's opposition to Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville and his preference for a French alliance over Burgundian connections led to a dramatic reversal of allegiances. Warwick's alliance with Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI as queen, was one of the most remarkable political reversals in English history. The man who had destroyed Lancastrian power now sought to restore it, demonstrating that personal ambition often trumped ideological consistency in medieval politics. Edward IV's return from exile in 1471 and his victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury effectively ended the Wars of the Roses' first phase. The deaths of Warwick at Barnet and Prince Edward, Henry VI's son, at Tewkesbury, followed by Henry VI's murder in the Tower of London, eliminated the Lancastrian leadership and seemed to secure Yorkist rule. Edward's second reign, 1471 to 1483, was marked by relative peace and prosperity. The king's administrative reforms, commercial policies and diplomatic successes restored royal authority and demonstrated that effective monarchy was still possible. Edward's invasion of France in 1475, which ended with a profitable peace treaty rather than military conquest, showed a new pragmatism in English foreign policy. However, Edward's sudden death in 1483 at the age of 40 precipitated a new crisis. The succession of his 12-year-old son, Edward V, created opportunities for ambitious nobles to seize power, while the questionable legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage raised doubts about his children's right to inherit. Richard III's usurpation of the throne in 1483 was both a personal tragedy and a political necessity. As Lord Protector for his young nephew, Richard faced a choice between allowing the Woodville family to control the new king or seizing power himself. His decision to declare Edward V and his brother illegitimate and claim the throne for himself was legally questionable, but politically understandable. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's great mysteries, but contemporary opinion held Richard responsible for their deaths. This belief, whether justified or not, fatally undermined Richard's legitimacy and provided his enemies with a powerful propaganda weapon. Richard's brief reign was marked by competent administration and progressive legislation, but his political position remained precarious. The rebellion of the Duke of Buckingham in 1483 and the emergence of Henry Tudor as a Lancastrian claimant created threats that Richard struggled to contain. The Battle of Bosworth Field on August 22nd, 1485 was one of the most decisive battles in English history. Henry Tudor's victory over Richard III ended not just the Wars of the Roses, but the entire Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. The battle itself was small by medieval standards, involving perhaps 15,000 men total, but its political consequences were enormous. Richard's death in the fighting, he was the last English king to die in battle, ended the Yorkist cause and cleared the way for Tudor rule. Henry's victory was due as much to political skill as military prowess. His ability to win over key nobles like the Stanley family, who controlled the battle's outcome, demonstrated the importance of coalition building in medieval politics. The crown that was allegedly found on Richard's body and placed on Henry's head at the battlefield symbolised the transfer of royal authority. Henry VII's succession marked the beginning of a new era in English history. The first Tudor king faced the enormous challenge of establishing a new dynasty's legitimacy while healing the wounds left by 30 years of civil war. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the rival houses, was a masterstroke of political symbolism that helped reconcile former enemies. The Wars of the Roses had fundamentally altered English society. The old nobility had been decimated by decades of warfare, creating opportunities for new men to rise in royal service. The Crown's financial resources had been depleted, forcing new approaches to taxation and administration. Most importantly, the wars had demonstrated the dangers of weak kingship and factional conflict, creating a desire for strong, stable government that would characterise the Tudor period. The medieval period in English history was ending. The feudal system that had dominated English society since the Norman conquest was giving way to new forms of government and social organisation. The Renaissance, the Reformation and the Age of Exploration were about to transform England from a medieval kingdom into a modern European power. The foundations laid during the medieval period, the common law, parliamentary government and national identity forged through centuries of conflict, would provide the basis for England's future greatness. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field made him King of England, but it did not make him secure. The first Tudor monarch faced challenges that would have destroyed a less capable ruler: a depleted treasury, a war-weary nobility, ongoing threats from Yorkist pretenders, and the fundamental problem of establishing a new dynasty's legitimacy in a kingdom exhausted by civil war. Henry's solution was to govern with a combination of parsimony, pragmatism, and ruthless efficiency that transformed both the monarchy and the kingdom. Unlike his medieval predecessors who had relied primarily on feudal obligations and military conquest, Henry understood that royal power in the late 15th century required financial independence, administrative competence, and careful management of noble ambitions. The new king's financial policies were revolutionary in their scope and effectiveness. Henry systematically rebuilt the royal treasury through a combination of traditional revenues, new taxes, and innovative financial instruments. He revived dormant feudal obligations, imposed heavy fines for legal infractions, and created a system of bonds and recognizances that kept potential rebels financially dependent on royal favour. The Court of Star Chamber, established to deal with noble lawlessness, became a symbol of Tudor efficiency and royal authority. Unlike traditional courts, which were often dominated by local magnates, Star Chamber was staffed by royal appointees who owed their positions entirely to the crown. The court's ability to impose heavy fines and imprisonment without trial by jury made it a powerful instrument of royal control over the nobility. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York was a masterstroke of political symbolism that helped heal the wounds of the Wars of the Roses. The union of the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York created the Tudor Rose, a powerful symbol of national unity that would adorn royal buildings and documents for over a century. More practically, the marriage gave Henry's children a claim to the throne through both Lancastrian and Yorkist lines, strengthening the dynasty's legitimacy. However, Henry's reign was constantly threatened by Yorkist pretenders who challenged his right to rule. Lambert Simnel, who claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick, and Perkin Warbeck, who posed as Richard, Duke of York, one of the princes in the Tower, both attracted significant support from foreign powers and domestic malcontents. Henry's defeat of these pretenders demonstrated both his military competence and his political acumen in isolating his enemies. The king's foreign policy was characterized by the same careful pragmatism that marked his domestic governance. Rather than pursuing expensive military adventures, Henry sought to secure England's position through diplomacy, trade agreements, and strategic marriages. The Treaty of Medina del Campo, 1489, with Spain and the marriage of his eldest son Arthur to Catherine of Aragon, were designed to align England with the emerging Habsburg Spanish power bloc. Henry's commercial policies laid the foundations for England's later economic expansion. The Navigation Acts, which required English goods to be carried in English ships, stimulated the growth of the merchant marine. Trade agreements with the Netherlands, the Baltic states, and the Mediterranean opened new markets for English wool and cloth. The king's support for explorers like John Cabot, who reached North America in 1497, demonstrated an early interest in overseas expansion. The death of Prince Arthur in 1502 created a succession crisis that would have profound consequences for English and European history. Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been the cornerstone of Henry's Spanish alliance, and his death left the future of that alliance uncertain. The decision to marry Catherine to Arthur's younger brother Henry was politically necessary, but canonically questionable, requiring a papal dispensation that would later become a source of enormous controversy. Henry VII's own death in 1509 brought to the throne a young man who was everything his father was not. Where Henry VII had been cautious, calculating and parsimonious, Henry VIII was impulsive, charismatic and extravagant. The new king inherited a full treasury, a stable kingdom and a strong administrative system. But he would use these advantages in ways his father never intended. Henry VIII's early reign seemed to promise a golden age for England. The young king was intelligent, athletic and cultured, speaking several languages and composing music that was performed throughout Europe. His court became a centre of Renaissance learning and artistic achievement, attracting scholars like Thomas More and artists like Hans Holbein. The king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon initially appeared successful, but the failure to produce a male heir created anxieties that would ultimately transform England. Catherine's multiple pregnancies resulted in only one surviving child, Princess Mary, and by the 1520s it was clear that the Queen was unlikely to bear more children. Henry's concern about the succession was both personal and political. The Wars of the Roses had demonstrated the dangers of disputed successions, and the king was determined to leave a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. His growing conviction that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God, based on the biblical prohibition against marrying a brother's widow, provided both a theological justification for annulment and a solution to the succession problem. The King's Great Matter, as the annulment proceedings became known, consumed English politics for 6 years and ultimately led to England's break with Rome. Henry's case was legally complex but not unprecedented. Royal marriages had been annulled before on similar grounds. However, the political circumstances of the 1520s made papal approval impossible. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, whose armies had sacked Rome in 1527 and effectively held Pope Clement VII prisoner. The Pope could not grant Henry's annulment without offending the most powerful ruler in Europe, creating a deadlock that no amount of English pressure could break. Cardinal Thomas Wolsey's rise and fall epitomise the opportunities and dangers of Tudor service. The son of a butcher from Ipswich, Wolsey had risen through the church hierarchy to become Archbishop of York, Cardinal, and Lord Chancellor, effectively the second most powerful man in England. Wolsey's administrative genius had made him indispensable to Henry VIII during the early years of the reign. The Cardinal managed Parliament, conducted foreign policy, and oversaw the royal finances with an efficiency that allowed Henry to focus on his personal interests. Wolsey's palace at Hampton Court rivaled the king's own residences in magnificence, demonstrating the wealth and power that royal service could bring. However, Wolsey's failure to secure the papal annulment of Henry's marriage proved fatal to his career. Despite years of diplomatic manoeuvring, including secret negotiations with the Pope and attempts to pressure the papal court, Wolsey could not deliver what his master demanded. His fall from power in 1529 was swift and complete, demonstrating that no one, regardless of their previous service, was safe from royal displeasure. Wolsey's replacement by Thomas More as Lord Chancellor marked a significant shift in royal policy. More, a humanist scholar and author of Utopia, was known for his integrity and learning, but he was also a committed Catholic who opposed the king's annulment proceedings. His appointment suggested that Henry still hoped to resolve the matter within the framework of traditional Catholic doctrine. The emergence of Thomas Cromwell as Henry's chief minister marked the beginning of the most revolutionary period in English history since the Norman conquest. Cromwell, a lawyer and administrator who had served in Wolsey's household, brought to royal service a combination of legal expertise, administrative efficiency, and political ruthlessness that would transform England's relationship with both Rome and its own past. Cromwell's solution to the king's great matter was characteristically radical. If the Pope would not grant the annulment, England would break with Rome entirely and establish the king as supreme head of the English Church. This was not merely a diplomatic manoeuvre, but a fundamental restructuring of English society that would have consequences far beyond the royal marriage. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, declared Henry VIII to be the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, effectively making the English monarch both temporal and spiritual ruler of his kingdom. This was a revolutionary concept that challenged the entire medieval understanding of the relationship between secular and religious authority. The dissolution of the monasteries, 1536 to 1541, was perhaps the most dramatic consequence of the break with Rome. England's monasteries, which had been centres of learning, charity and spiritual life for centuries, were systematically closed and their wealth transferred to the crown. The dissolution provided Henry with enormous financial resources while eliminating potential centres of opposition to the new religious settlement. The human cost of the dissolution was enormous. Thousands of monks and nuns were pensioned off or left to fend for themselves, while the poor who had depended on monastic charity were left without support. The destruction of monastic libraries resulted in the loss of countless manuscripts and works of art that had been preserved for centuries. However, the dissolution also had positive consequences for English development. The redistribution of monastic lands created a new class of landowners who had a vested interest in supporting the Protestant settlement. The wealth transferred to the crown funded military improvements, educational initiatives and administrative reforms that strengthened royal government. The most serious challenge to Henry's religious revolution came in 1536 with the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive popular uprising in northern England that combined religious, economic and political grievances. The rebellion, which involved an estimated 40,000 participants, was the largest popular uprising in English history and posed a genuine threat to Tudor rule. The pilgrimage was led by Robert Ascey, a lawyer who articulated the rebels' demands with remarkable sophistication. The pilgrims called for the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of heretical advisors like Thomas Cromwell, and the return to traditional Catholic practices. Their grievances reflected widespread popular opposition to the religious changes and economic disruption caused by the dissolution. Henry's response to the pilgrimage demonstrated both his political skill and his ruthlessness. Rather than immediately resorting to military force, the king negotiated with the rebels, promising to consider their demands and granting pardons to the participants. However, when a second uprising occurred in early 1537, Henry used it as a pretext to break his promises and execute the rebellion's leaders. The suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace was brutal and systematic. Over 200 rebels were executed, including Robert Ascey, who was hanged in chains at York Castle. The king's betrayal of his promises demonstrated that traditional concepts of royal honour were subordinate to political necessity in the new Tudor state. Henry VIII's 6 marriages were not merely personal relationships, but affairs of state that reflected the changing political and religious circumstances of his reign. Each marriage served specific dynastic, diplomatic or religious purposes, and the fate of each wife demonstrated the subordination of personal relationships to royal policy. Catherine of Aragon's marriage had been designed to cement the Spanish alliance, but her failure to produce a male heir made her a political liability. Her steadfast refusal to accept the annulment and her appeal to Rome made her a symbol of Catholic resistance to the new religious settlement. Anne Boleyn's marriage represented Henry's commitment to the break with Rome and the Protestant cause. Her coronation as queen while still pregnant demonstrated Henry's confidence that she would bear the male heir that Catherine had failed to provide. However, Anne's failure to produce a son and her alleged adultery provided Henry with the justification he needed to eliminate her when she became politically inconvenient. Jane Seymour's brief marriage and death in childbirth after producing the long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward, demonstrated both the fulfilment of Henry's dynastic ambitions and the personal cost of royal marriage. Jane's death within days of Edward's birth was seen as divine judgment on the king's treatment of his previous wives. Anne of Cleves's marriage was a diplomatic arrangement designed to align England with the Protestant German princes against the Catholic powers of Europe. However, the rapid deterioration of the international situation made the alliance unnecessary, and Henry's personal distaste for his new wife provided the excuse for a quick annulment. Catherine Howard's marriage represented Henry's attempt to recapture his youth with a young and attractive wife. However, Catherine's alleged adultery and her failure to disclose her previous relationships provided Henry with grounds for execution that demonstrated the continuing dangers of royal marriage. Catherine Parr's marriage was perhaps the most successful of Henry's 6 unions. An intelligent and educated woman who shared Henry's interest in religious reform, Catherine served as both wife and nurse to the ageing king while successfully navigating the dangerous waters of court politics. Henry VIII's death in 1547 brought his 9-year-old son Edward VI to the throne under the regency of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. The new reign marked the beginning of the most radical phase of the English Reformation, as Protestant reformers sought to complete the religious revolution that Henry had begun. Somerset's religious policies went far beyond anything Henry had contemplated. The Act of Uniformity, 1549, imposed a new Protestant prayer book on all English churches, while the destruction of religious images and the introduction of clerical marriage marked a decisive break with Catholic tradition. These changes were driven by genuine religious conviction, but also by the political need to align England with Protestant Europe. The economic and social policies of Edward's reign were equally radical. The enclosure of common lands, the debasement of the currency, and the continued dissolution of religious institutions created widespread hardship that culminated in popular uprisings in 1549. Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk and the Western Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall demonstrated that religious and economic grievances could combine to threaten royal authority. Somerset's fall from power in 1549 brought John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, to prominence as the new Lord Protector. Northumberland's policies were even more radical than Somerset's, including the introduction of a second, more Protestant prayer book and the systematic looting of church wealth to fund government operations. The most controversial act of Northumberland's regency was his attempt to alter the succession in favour of Lady Jane Grey, his daughter-in-law and a Protestant claimant to the throne. Edward VI's death in 1553 at the age of 15 precipitated a succession crisis that would test the strength of Protestant settlement and the loyalty of the English people to the Tudor dynasty. Mary Tudor's accession to the throne in 1553, despite Northumberland's attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, demonstrated the continuing strength of legitimate monarchy and popular opposition to religious extremism. Mary's victory over Northumberland was achieved through a combination of legal right, popular support, and the loyalty of conservative nobles who preferred a Catholic Tudor to a Protestant usurper. Mary's reign represented a systematic attempt to reverse the English Reformation and restore England to Catholic unity. The Queen's marriage to Philip II of Spain was designed to align England with the leading Catholic power in Europe, while her religious policies aimed to eliminate Protestant heresy and restore traditional Catholic practices. The Marian persecution, which resulted in the execution of nearly 300 Protestant reformers, was intended to demonstrate the consequences of religious dissent and discourage further Protestant activity. However, the burnings had the opposite effect, creating Protestant martyrs whose sufferings were recorded in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs and became a foundational text of English Protestant identity. The persecution's most prominent victims included Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury who had been instrumental in the English Reformation, and Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, bishops who had supported Protestant reform. Their executions at Oxford in 1555 to 1556 demonstrated Mary's determination to eliminate the Protestant leadership, but their courage in facing death strengthened Protestant resolve. Mary's marriage to Philip II proved to be a political disaster that alienated English opinion and failed to produce the Catholic heir that would have secured the Restoration. Philip's involvement in continental wars dragged England into conflicts that served Spanish rather than English interests, while his obvious preference for Spain over England created resentment among the English nobility. The loss of Calais to the French in 1558 was the final blow to Mary's reputation and the Catholic cause. The last English possession in France, which had been held for over 200 years, fell to French forces while Philip's attention was focused on his other territories. Mary's reported statement that Calais would be found written on her heart after death reflected the personal and political devastation of this loss. Elizabeth I's succession to the throne in 1558 at the age of 25 marked the beginning of one of the most successful reigns in English history. The new queen faced enormous challenges: a kingdom divided by religious conflict, a depleted treasury, threats from Catholic Europe, and questions about her own legitimacy as the daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth's religious settlement was a masterpiece of political compromise that sought to unite the kingdom while avoiding the extremes of both Catholic reaction and Protestant radicalism. The Elizabethan settlement established a moderate Protestant church that retained many traditional practices while rejecting papal authority and Catholic doctrine. The Act of Supremacy, 1559, restored royal supremacy over the English Church, while the Act of Uniformity imposed a new prayer book that was more moderate than Edward VI's second prayer book, but clearly Protestant in orientation. The 39 Articles, 1563, defined Anglican doctrine in terms that were acceptable to most Protestants, while it avoiding the more controversial aspects of Calvinist theology. Elizabeth's approach to religious dissent was pragmatic rather than ideological. While she insisted on outward conformity to the established church, she was generally tolerant of private religious beliefs provided they did not threaten public order. Her famous statement that she did not wish to make windows into men's souls reflected this policy of limited toleration. Elizabeth's refusal to marry was one of the most controversial aspects of her reign and created ongoing anxiety about the succession. The Queen's unmarried status was unprecedented for a female ruler and generated constant pressure from Parliament, her councillors, and foreign suitors who sought to gain influence through marriage. The Queen's courtships were elaborate political dances that served diplomatic purposes while avoiding the commitment of actual marriage. Her relationships with Eric the Wealthy of Sweden, Archduke Charles of Austria, and the Duc d'Anjou were all designed to maintain diplomatic options while avoiding the loss of independence that marriage would entail. The most serious of Elizabeth's courtships was her relationship with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, which lasted for over 2 decades and generated enormous controversy. Dudley's marriage to Amy Robsart and her mysterious death in 1560 created a scandal that made marriage to Elizabeth politically impossible, but their relationship continued to influence court politics throughout the reign. Elizabeth's decision to remain unmarried was both personal and political. Marriage would have subordinated her to a husband and potentially compromised English independence, while remaining single allowed her to use the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic weapon. Her cultivation of the image of the Virgin Queen, married to England itself, became a powerful symbol of national independence and royal dedication. The presence of Mary Queen of Scots in England from 1568 to 1587 created a constant threat to Elizabeth's security and a focus for Catholic opposition to the Protestant settlement. Mary's claim to the English throne through her descent from Henry VII, combined with her Catholic faith and foreign connections, made her a natural rallying point for those who opposed Elizabeth's rule. Mary's arrival in England as a refugee from Scottish politics placed Elizabeth in an impossible position. As a fellow queen, Mary deserved protection and hospitality, but as a claimant to the English throne, she represented an existential threat to Elizabeth's security. The decision to hold Mary in honourable captivity was a compromise that satisfied neither humanitarian concerns nor security requirements. The series of plots that swirled around Mary during her captivity demonstrated the continuing strength of Catholic opposition to the Elizabethan settlement. The Ridolfi plot, 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and the Babington plot, 1586, all aimed to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne with foreign assistance, usually from Spain or France. Elizabeth's reluctance to execute Mary reflected both personal sympathy for a fellow queen and political calculation about the consequences of regicide. The execution of an anointed monarch would set a dangerous precedent and might provoke foreign intervention on Mary's behalf. However, the discovery of Mary's involvement in the Babington plot finally convinced Elizabeth that her rival's continued existence was incompatible with English security. Mary's execution at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587, was a dramatic event that resonated throughout Europe. Mary's dignity in facing death, her assertion of her Catholic faith, and her claim to martyrdom created a powerful symbol that would inspire Catholic resistance for generations. However, the execution also eliminated the most serious threat to Elizabeth's throne and cleared the way for the final confrontation with Spain. Philip II's decision to launch the Enterprise of England in 1588 was motivated by a combination of religious zeal, political calculation, and personal revenge. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots had eliminated Philip's preferred candidate for the English throne, but it had also provided him with a pretext for invasion that would be supported by Catholic opinion throughout Europe. The Spanish Armada that sailed from Lisbon in May 1588 was the largest naval force ever assembled, consisting of 130 ships carrying over 30,000 men. The plan was for the Armada to sail to the Netherlands, embark the Duke of Parma's veteran army, and transport this force to England for a coordinated invasion that would restore Catholic rule. However, the plan was flawed from the beginning. The Armada's ships were designed for Mediterranean warfare and were poorly suited to the rough seas of the Atlantic and the English Channel. The Spanish tactics, which relied on boarding and hand-to-hand combat, were obsolete against English ships that could use their superior manoeuvrability and long-range guns to avoid close combat. The English response was coordinated by a group of experienced naval commanders, including Lord Howard of Effingham, Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins. These men had learned their trade in the privateering wars against Spanish shipping and understood both the capabilities and limitations of Spanish naval power. The running battles in the English Channel demonstrated English tactical superiority and Spanish vulnerability. The English ships, which were faster and more manoeuvrable than their Spanish counterparts, could choose when and where to fight while avoiding the boarding actions that Spanish tactics required. The decisive moment came at Gravelines on August 8, 1588, when English fireships scattered the Spanish formation and English guns inflicted heavy damage on the disorganised Spanish fleet. The Armada's attempt to regroup was frustrated by adverse winds that drove the Spanish ships into the North Sea, forcing them to attempt the dangerous voyage around Scotland and Ireland. The destruction of the Armada during its return voyage was caused more by storms than by English action, but the strategic result was the same. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, fewer than 60 returned, and Spanish naval power was crippled for a generation. The victory established England as a major naval power and demonstrated that Catholic Europe could not impose its will on Protestant England. The defeat of the Spanish Armada ushered in the period known as the Elizabethan Golden Age, characterized by cultural flowering, economic expansion, and growing national confidence. The sense that England had been chosen by God for a special destiny, reinforced by the miraculous defeat of the Armada, created an atmosphere of optimism and achievement that permeated all aspects of English society. The literary achievements of the Elizabethan period were unprecedented in English history. William Shakespeare's plays, which combined classical learning with popular appeal, created a new form of drama that influenced world literature for centuries. Christopher Marlowe's tragedies explored themes of ambition and power that reflected the spirit of the age, while Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen created an epic poem that celebrated both Elizabeth and English national identity. The expansion of English trade during Elizabeth's reign laid the foundations for England's later commercial empire. The Muscovy Company, established in 1555, opened trade with Russia through the Arctic route. The Levant Company, founded in 1581, competed with Venice for the lucrative Mediterranean trade. Most importantly, the East India Company, chartered in 1600, began the English penetration of Asian markets that would eventually lead to the conquest of India. English exploration and colonisation efforts during this period were less successful than trade ventures, but established important precedents for future expansion. Sir Humphrey Gilbert's attempts to colonise Newfoundland and Sir Walter Raleigh's efforts to establish a colony at Roanoke both failed, but they demonstrated English determination to challenge Spanish and Portuguese monopolies in the New World. The privateering campaigns against Spanish shipping, led by figures like Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins, combined patriotism with profit in ways that captured the English imagination. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, 1577 to 1580, was both a remarkable feat of navigation and a devastating attack on Spanish commerce that brought enormous wealth to England. Elizabeth's reign was marked by persistent problems in Ireland that would plague English rule for centuries. The Irish remained largely Catholic and resented English attempts to impose Protestant settlement and English law. The plantation of English and Scottish settlers in Ireland created religious and ethnic tensions that periodically erupted into rebellion. The most serious Irish challenge to Elizabeth's rule was the 9 Years' War, 1594 to 1603, led by Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, and Hugh O'Donnell, Earl of Tyrconnell. These Gaelic lords combined traditional Irish military tactics with modern European weapons and training, creating a formidable force that inflicted several defeats on English armies. The Irish rebels' alliance with Spain, which resulted in the landing of Spanish troops at Kinsale in 1601, transformed a local rebellion into a European conflict. However, the Spanish force was too small to be decisive, and the Irish failure to coordinate their efforts with their Spanish allies led to defeat at the Battle of Kinsale. The English victory in Ireland was achieved through a combination of military superiority and systematic devastation that foreshadowed later colonial policies. The scorched earth tactics employed by English commanders like Lord Mountjoy created famine conditions that forced Irish submission, but also generated lasting resentment against English rule. Elizabeth's death on March 24, 1603 marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new chapter in English history. The Queen's refusal to marry had achieved its political objectives. England had remained independent and Protestant, but it had also created a succession crisis that could only be resolved by turning to the Scottish royal house. The peaceful accession of James VI of Scotland as James I of England demonstrated the success of Elizabeth's policies and the stability of the English political system. However, the union of the English and Scottish crowns would create new challenges and opportunities that would test the institutions and traditions that the Tudors had created. The Tudor transformation of England was complete. The medieval kingdom that Henry VII had inherited in 1485 had been replaced by a modern European state with a professional bureaucracy, a national church, and a growing sense of national identity. The religious revolution that had begun with Henry VIII's break with Rome had created a Protestant nation that saw itself as chosen by God for a special destiny. The economic and social changes of the Tudor period had been equally dramatic. The dissolution of the monasteries had redistributed wealth and created new social relationships. The expansion of trade had enriched the merchant classes and connected England to global markets. The growth of London had created a cosmopolitan capital that rivaled Paris and Rome in size and importance. Perhaps most importantly, the Tudor period had established the principle of royal supremacy over both church and state, while creating institutions that would eventually limit that supremacy. Parliament had been strengthened by its role in the religious settlement. The common law had been extended and systematised, and the concept of English national identity had been forged in the crucible of religious and military conflict. The England that Elizabeth bequeathed to James I was confident, prosperous, and united in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1485. The foundations had been laid for the global empire that would emerge in the following centuries, while the institutions and traditions that would make England a model for constitutional government had been established. The Tudor transformation was complete, and England was ready to play a leading role on the world stage. This, my friends, is the end of part 1. If you're still awake, you may now switch to part 2 of our History of Britain series for better sleep. I hope that you enjoyed this piece of history, and if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and let me know in the comments from where you are listening and what time it is in your city. Also, let me know if you prefer to have subtitles for those sleep videos or if I should continue without them.